That's why we need to encourage businesses to invest in capital so that we're more automated. That's why in the budget we introduced full expensing, which makes it very competitive to invest in capital in the UK.
It tells you that the 2030 phase-out date saves billions of pounds across our economy. Today's measure isn't cost-reducing, it is cost-raising.
What is your response to that? That yes, we want to keep people safe, but we also need to protect people's privacy online.
Good afternoon and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and particularly on a day where the climate seems to be underlining its importance and making us all very keenly aware of the weather. My name is Kate Day. I am Politico Europe's Deputy Editor-in-Chief. I founded Politico here in the UK back in 2017, and we've been quietly but steadily building ever since then, I would say. I'm sure it won't be news to most of you in the room, or I hope it won't be news to most of you in the room, that we now cover energy and climate in quite some detail. You may not know the history, but Politico was founded in Washington in 2007, and we've developed this model of covering politics and policy in a distinctive, non-partisan, slightly different way, we like to think. We've taken that recipe from Washington to Brussels and now to London, Paris, Berlin, California. We're gradually expanding out. We aim to be in every democratic country. We're not sure it works beyond democracies, so we're pretty committed to being in democracies, but our aim is to be the best for politics and policy everywhere in the democratic world. And one of the secrets of our success, and one of the places we've expanded, particularly in the UK in the last year, is Politico Pro. That's our intelligence service, the backbone of which is this distinctive, detailed policy coverage. We are geeks, we love the detail, we want to hear from everybody on all sides of the debate and really get beneath the politics into the substance of what political decisions mean for all of our lives, for the economy, for Britain's place in the world. And I'm delighted to have such a fantastic team here with me who you will hear from in a minute. But first, I wanted to just thank our sponsors, thank all of you for being in the room, and thank our guests who are joining us on stage. We are delighted to hear from you all. As I said, hearing from every side of the argument is a big part of what we do at Politico. The Secretary of State actually asked if, instead of being interviewed by me, she could provide a little video for you all, and we said, no, thank you very much. We do journalism. We want to hear really what you think, and we want to be able to scrutinize that. So that's us, that's what we're about. I'm going to hand over to Russ, our UK energy editor, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you, and he's going to have a conversation with our new energy team. So Russ and team, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate, ever so much. Kate said two things which I think are very true there. One is that we are journalists. That's definitely true. And the other that we're geeks, which I think, I don't want to put these three guys in that category, but you can all make your own minds up over the next couple of hours as to how this all unfolds. I'm Russell Hargrave. I'm the editor of the UK Climate and Energy Reporting team for Politico. As Kate said, about 1 year old. We look back a year and we think, well, Grant Shapps was the shiny-faced new Secretary of State, just getting his feet under the table. We didn't know whether or not there'd be licensing permission for Rosebank. There were so many questions we didn't know. And now we've moved forward a year very, very quickly, a lot of policy developments in very little time. To introduce the people who have actually been doing all the hard work, editors really, all you do is move words around and put some inverted commas in. The guys who are really working on this, to introduce the team, left to further left, Abby Wallace, Charlie Cooper, and Nick Earle. And these guys will get a chance to talk a little bit more shortly. But just to give an overview, since the moment we started this product in last June, net zero by 2050. That's been the great lodestar, if you like, the thing that we have focused on as reporters pretty much continuously. Who are the characters who are going to get us there as a country or not? The politicians, the officials, the industry leaders, the skeptics and the zealots across the board, as Kate says, talking to everybody, frankly, who's got an interesting opinion and might be newsworthy. We've wanted to make sure that we can serve people who are getting that morning newsletter, reading our news, our breaking stories, so I'll tell you all about it. And if you did know that the Chancellor had oil and gas executives into number 11 yesterday to try and cheer them up because they're worried about tax rises, you knew it because Nick reported it, and it was him who covered that before anybody else. If you know, for example, that the Energy Charter Treaty that the UK has been so unhappy about for so long, finally that kind of split is happening, we know it because Charlie broke that story. And if we know that Kemi Badenoch and Claire Coutinho don't really see eye to eye on all sorts of issues about the UK economy, including green subsidies, that's because Abby was the person who brought that story to you before anybody else. So obviously I'm biased. I think everything we do is pretty much terrific, and I hope we're going to have a chance to kind of show a bit more of that and learn so much more in the next sessions. So on which topic? Charlie, you'll be talking about rewiring the country for as long as I've known you for the last year. You've always been keen to talk about pylons and grid reform. Why is this such a big issue? What are you going to touch on?
Well, you talked about geeks, and I feel I have become a bit of a pylon geek. There is a, you might be familiar with the Twitter account, Pylon of the Week, I think it is.
Who isn't familiar with that?
I mean, I follow it. I think we all should. No, the first panel is called Rewiring the Country, so we're talking new renewables to get to those totemic clean power targets 2035 if you're the government, 2030 if you're Labour. And when we talked about when we first launched and how things have changed since then, one thing I guess has not changed is that when we were setting out, everyone I spoke to said that grid is kind of the education of this sector. And we've seen a lot of developments in the past year on that front, but I don't think it's going to stop being an absolutely critical issue. Just today, you've got Labour with their first steps, their kind of pledge card for the election. One of them is GB Energy, and that segues into their Clean Power 2030 target, something they're putting pretty close to the centre of their political offer for voters. And I think that means if we do have a Labour government, it's only going to grow in political salience, the ability or inability to meet that quite stretching target. So we'll be talking about all of that, including maybe a bit about Mallard Pass Solar Farm, which just today has had a decision delayed on its consent. So something to talk about there as well.
And just very quickly, the role of sort of people who don't want pylons in their back gardens is a big part of this as well.
How could I launch into this without mentioning the NIMBYs? Yes, you're quite right. No, that perhaps is where the political salience will bite. And we covered some research actually by Public First, which interestingly found that a Labour government would be in a position to maybe implement a lot of these changes, put up all those pylons in constituencies, which actually belong to Conservative MPs. So, but will a Conservative Party in opposition take that lying down? Will newspapers take that lying down? It could be an interesting 5 years if Labour do get into power and do try and achieve that 2030 target.
Cracking stuff, thank you. Abby, you're going to be talking about Contracts for Difference, the great renewables subsidy programme, which has been a real success story, I think, in policymaking. And then last year, fell off a bit of a cliff and wasn't much of a success story. What's the role, do you think, for Contracts for Difference going forward?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Contracts for Difference scheme has been a UK success story. It's been at the forefront of the government's energy strategy up to this point in terms of bringing more renewables online, decarbonising the power sector, providing that sense of real price certainty for investors. A significant chunk, I think it's maybe around more than half, of the UK's offshore wind capacity has been secured through CFD auctions. Maybe our panellists might want to correct that later, but I think it's in and around that ballpark. But crucially, the scheme has not delivered the capacity in recent auction rounds to hit decarbonisation targets. That's especially true for offshore wind. Auction round 5, as I'm sure many people in this room will know, did not receive any bids for offshore wind. And industry had warned for some time that the price parameters were not set accordingly to account for inflationary pressure and that the strike price was just far too low. And I think that was a real setback for the sector and for the government's energy strategy as a whole. And it means there's a lot of pressure on the next round, AR6, which is just open to deliver and to make up for that lost capacity. The reason the government really needs to deliver in the next round is the scheme is also operating in a very different climate to the one in which it was first introduced. The cost of delivering these projects is increasing. There are big global pressures. The UK is not the only country or the only place competing for this investment. And also there are targets to hit 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Ministers have adjusted the parameters for the next auction round, but the window that the government has to deliver on those targets is only getting narrower. So I'm sure our panellists will have more to say on that later.
I'm sure, and find out how optimistic or not industry and politicians are about working together on it. And Nick, finally, you'll be talking later on about carbon capture, this sort of always promised, sometimes ready technology that a lot of people are relying on very strongly, I think, to kind of help steer us towards net zero. How do you see it? Is carbon capture the kind of future of getting us green, or is it a bit of a delight for anyone who's polluting and can carry on polluting?
Yeah, that's right. So for any of the energy nerds, the vanguards, they'll be here for all 3 sessions. You'll see the CCS discussion later today. The way I'd put it really is that the question really is about, does the government have any other choice? And that's really sort of the key argument you're kind of hearing from people within the industry, almost in a way similar to the controversy around biomass, which is, it probably isn't ideal to be burying emissions underneath the seabed and continuing oil and gas production, but do we actually have any other credible means to reach net zero while not shivering in our cold, dark homes? And I guess when it comes to this, I'll be happy to grill Equinor, one of our benevolent sponsors, about the £20 billion government pledge there's been towards carbon capture. For context, about half of Hinkley Point C we're talking about here, so quite a hefty outlay. And the fact there's not been that much in terms of development since September, really, when track 1 and track 2 kind of got unveiled. So hopefully we'll be hearing Equinor's case for their projects. We're hearing also from the very learned Green Alliance, who will offer a robust differing of opinion, and also seeing what other alternatives there could be. So I think it should be a lively pre-happy hour session.
And that, you mentioned the 20 billion in government investment, which is spread over quite a long period. What's your sense of whether or not that sort of sum of money is going to make a difference? Is that going to kind of attract the sort of extra investment that's needed, do you think?
I mean, without trying to sound a little bit cheeky, it really should. It's a vast sum of money, and we're talking about companies that have themselves very significant cash flows that are making a case that are going to transition towards net zero. Now, this is probably the least painful operation of doing that compared to commitments to offshore wind and commitments to green hydrogen storage, for example. So you would think this would be an area where they could really offer their expertise, their insight, their approach, and we can actually really see some quite material commitments with the funds that have been offered.
Okay.
It's also, it's related to my panel and the 2030, 2035 targets as well, isn't it? Because as far as I understand it, both of those depend on a bit of carbon capture. There's an understanding that there's a degree of unabated gas for flexibility in the system, but a significant amount of gas still in the system needs to have carbon capture attached to it, and biomass as well, for those to be achievable. And I just, until we see sort of concrete action, literally concrete action, spades going into the ground maybe end of this year, is that really feasible by 2030? Well, maybe not by 2035 even. So I'm intrigued to hear what Equinor and others have to say about that.
Yeah, it's worth saying that all these panels are in a way linked, of course, because Rewiring the country, we have, I think, an estimate of 2062 might actually be when we actually decarbonise the grid.
That's the Tony Blair Institute's estimate, yeah.
Yeah, so if you
we
bear
could
that
still all be here in a very long time, still talking about decarbonisation, which is alarming, but there we are.
Yeah, we're not going to ask you to stay with us until 2062, but certainly we'll cover as much ground as we can for the afternoon. You were talking about global pressures as well, Abby. Obviously, that's partly in contrast to difference and how we're going to build all of these, the infrastructure that we need to look at. But also, we've had 2 reports in 2 days that have basically said UK infrastructure is in lots of trouble as well at the moment, just general how good the government is at building up these big projects. Do you think the government's in a position to kind of get better? Are we going to see a change of government that might actually see a new focus? Where do you think we'll land?
I mean, it's a tricky one. Inflationary pressure is obviously the big point. I mean, in terms of CFDs, the schemes that CFD targets, they're capital-intensive projects. They take a lot of time to get up. You know, the scheme is obviously designed to alleviate some of those pressure points in terms of providing that sense of certainty for investors, but in a world where, you know, project costs are increasing, it does take longer to get, you know, as Charlie said, spades in the ground. And there are also different players vying for investment. You know, it becomes trickier and it becomes more important for the UK to have a really solid offer to industry, and essentially one that they can't say no to. I mean, the reason why we saw AR5 fail to, or under-deliver, is because of those inflationary pressures and price points. Yeah, there's also the pressure of competition. I've said this before, but the UK is competing with other countries who increasingly have attractive things to offer on all of the technologies that we will talk about. You know, there are tax credits on offer in the US for these things. The EU has funding schemes in place. And supply chain is a limited resource at the end of the day.
And that's one of the kind of big sweeping questions that we think about every day, I think, and maybe this is one for you, Charlie, is kind of for a lot of our early reporting, the first 6 months, we wrote about nothing but the IRA in the US and about the EU Green Deal and about competing on what felt like quite an unlevel playing field. Some, as we've already mentioned, some ministers rather liked the idea that the UK was stepping back from subsidies. Some thought it was the only way to get there. Labour have moved around all over the place a little bit recently on how much they will subsidise, but certainly the ambition is there. How much is this going to be a set of difficult financial decisions in the next 10 and 20 years, as much as, green zealotry?
I mean, that immediately makes me think of the 28 billion
yeah.
and where that has gone. I mean, I think a lot of people maybe in this room looked at that and thought, yes, that's the scale of ambition that is required to really get the UK back into the game globally in terms of the pursuit of the dividends of the green energy transition that is, many would say now, unstoppable across the world. However, Labour have looked at the books. They've also looked at their need to appear sort of fiscally prudent to many Conservative voters that they're trying to win over, and they've said, actually, no, big red mark through that 28 billion. They managed to do it without actually scrapping too much of the scheme, because they never actually said where most of that money was going, which was quite a nifty sleight of hand. But yeah, I think that is a real pressure, and I do wonder how much the upward pressure on Labour spending over the next 3 to 5 years, if they do get in, will be a feature of our politics going forward. If the pressures to sort of get back in the global race only grow.
Yeah. So plenty of questions for the UK, plenty of questions that go way, way beyond these shores as well, and we'll be touching on all of those. That will start with Charlie. The three of us are going to quietly leave the stage, leaving Charlie to take over the next session. But for now, thank you very much. I hope you all have a smashing day. And I hope you're all subscribers to our morning email. We work very hard on it, especially the jokes. So if you ever want to tell us more about it, you can always get in touch with the normal ways. All right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Hi, Philip. Good to see you. Okay. Well, good afternoon and welcome if you're tuning in online, and hello again to those in the room at Politico's Energy and Climate UK Summit. My name is Charlie Cooper, and I'm Senior UK Energy Correspondent. This panel, as I mentioned in the previous chat, is all about, it's called Rewiring the Country, and it is all about, how I see it sometimes, is that battle of two targets, decarbonisation of the power grid by 2035 if you're the government, 2030 if you're Labour. That is a huge sort of step on the way to net zero 2050, eliminating those carbon emissions that come from the power sector. A brief reminder to talk to us on X if you're joining us online, or social media of your choice. Our hashtag is Politico Energy Climate UK. Also make sure to use our hashtag to ask questions during the upcoming discussion using on Slido if you're in the room. And please don't forget to mention your name and the organisation you are with when you do so. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our panellists. We have Tunne Langenen, Senior Policy Advisor on Climate and Energy Policy from the Tony Blair Institute. Mark Owen Lloyd, who is Director of the Botley West Solar Farm for Photovolt, that's in Oxfordshire. And Philip Dunn, MP for Ludlow and Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. I thought I would start with a bit of audience participation, always a fan of that, and I'll describe for those joining online. Who in the room thinks that decarbonisation by 2035 is achievable? Hands up. a fairly slender smattering of hands. I'd say less than half. It's quite hard to judge, but I'd say less than half. Interesting question now. Who thinks that decarbonisation by 2030 is possible, which is Labour's policy? Oof. Ed Miliband, you should be in this room. That's about 5 or 6 hands went up out of a fairly large audience. We did actually invite Labour to attend this panel and other panels. They unfortunately declined. I think if you could probably look on Twitter and find out why. We think it's unfortunate, but there we are. I will sort of ventriloquise for the Labour position when we require it for the debate. But Turner, to get us started, I should ask the panel, shouldn't I? How about for the three of you, 2030 or 2035, achievable? So let's start with you, Turner.
I am going to be very diplomatic and say it's going to be very, very, very challenging.
Which one?
But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't double down our efforts.
And that's 2035?
Both of them,
yeah.
Very, very challenging. They're not that different, actually, if you look into it. So
that's maybe the elephant in the room. Philip, I know you're not speaking for the government, but...
I'm certainly not speaking for the Labour Party. I think the 2030 ambition, just to put it in one piece of context, we are not going to get any new nuclear capacity on stream by 2030. That is an essential plank in order to decarbonise the economy by whatever date it can be done. I think 2035 has got enormous challenges, but is doable if, well, our committee is about to come out with a report. We're not going to opine on that, but we are going to point to what the challenges are shortly, and they remain, as I'm sure we'll be discussing, very significant. I think it's just about doable if everything goes right, and it rarely does in government.
And Mark, I see it as a kind of, well, it's a multifaceted challenge, but the two big chunks are getting the renewables or nuclear online, and then the grid. You are the director for a big solar farm. How do you see the feasibility of those two targets?
My background is as a trader, so I'm always keen on stretching targets. You get there if you give people challenging targets. But I think 2030 is impossible. 2035 is doable, but we have to accelerate the pace at which we're building, consenting and installing both ground-mounted solar. I'll talk only about solar because that's where the area I know, and crucially, roof-mounted solar. So change the leasehold laws, make it more attractive for householders to put it on. So we've got to accelerate it and shorten the DCO process, not delay DCO consents.
Yes, we'll come to that in a moment, I'm sure. Turner, you put out, from a kind of decarbonisation point of view, a very gloomy report last year, about this time last year, I think it was. So intriguing to know if you think anything's changed since. But the date that you put on the UK having sufficient renewables online to hit, to call itself a decarbonised electricity system was 2062. And then for the grid to be in a sort of a place where it could deliver that, 2062 was regardless of the grid. With the grid involved too, you're talking 2084, is that right?
that's right. Yeah.
Why so gloomy? Are we doomed in terms of our efforts towards this goal?
Well, I mean, so first of all, let's take one step back. So delivering clean power is absolutely essential to delivering net zero. I'm sure I don't need to tell that to anyone in the room here, but whether it's 2030 or 2035, electrification is our best path to tackling and dealing with climate change and delivering net zero. And to do that, you need to make sure that electricity is actually clean for it to lead to decarbonisation. But I think whether it's 2035 or 2030, it's going to be hugely challenging, and it will require a massive step up in pace. We need to roughly quadruple the amount of renewable generation we have at the moment, and we need to double the capacity of the grid, which is huge challenges for a country that hasn't been doing a lot of building recently. A lot of progress has obviously happened this far, but as you set out, the pace of delivery, if we compare the pace of delivery over the last 10 years with what we need to do over the next 10 years, we're nowhere close. So the renewables pace, the pace of renewables being added need to roughly be 4 times more every year than what we do now, which is quite a lot if you think about it. And at the same time, it takes more than a decade to build a transmission line, and also more than a decade to build a new offshore wind farm. And as you were mentioning as well, you know, nuclear, things like that, all of this is taking a whole lot of time, and we don't have a lot of time. I think the other thing to remember is that at the same time, this challenge is not actually just replacing one system with another. We're not replacing like for like, we're actually kind of completely transforming the way that we operate and do our energy system. So we're moving from a centralized system to a much more decentralized system, and we're moving from a kind of more static demand side and supply side to something where you got intermittent renewables and a more flexible demand side. And we're also experiencing increasing demand on electricity, and that's only going to be more and more of that with, for instance, more AI data centers, etc. So the challenge is kind of growing. And this comes with further challenges involved in delivering clean power, which we haven't talked about yet, or that hasn't been mentioned yet, but things like what do we do with long duration energy storage? What do we do with having kind of sufficient baseline supply of energy? And how do we get people along on this journey, both in terms of accepting new grid infrastructure in their homes or in their communities, but also how they can accept kind of being more flexible with how they use energy. But then there's also the opportunities, obviously, lower cost, energy security, and also a huge opportunity, I think, for UK clean tech, which I think is like the size of the prize there. So I think in some ways we should probably care less about the targets, even though they're really hard, and start focusing on the enablers to start getting us on the path to delivery. There's been a lot of arguing back and forth with 2030 and 2035, and I think we just need to...
Which I've encouraged, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Perhaps unfairly, I've asked you to set up the challenge. Philip, in your committee's inquiry into electrification of the UK economy, what solutions are you seeing coming through to some of those sort of pretty insurmountable sounding challenges that Tuan has set out?
So I think we've just heard a very sensible way of looking at this. I think targets are important to focus the mind within government. But what's much more important to secure delivery is having a plan within government, and a coherent plan which addresses all of the various components. Trying to electrify the economy is the biggest industrial undertaking that this country has ever sought to do in as short a period as we're talking about, whether it's 2030, 2035, but effectively we're trying to do it by 2050. That's the sort of end date. And it's going to be a massive challenge. We're not just talking about quadrupling solar, which we are. We're talking about, as you say, doubling the size of the grid. But we're also trying to change the way in which we consent for these enormous schemes, infrastructure projects. And I think one of the things the government did last autumn was to set out a sensible approach to try to halve the amount of time it takes to get a planning consent. Because one of the things that is different about this next wave of investment in renewables is that we're no longer sort of a market leader operating in our own bubble where we can generate the capacity, we can marshal international investment and corporates to build out the offshore wind turbines, which we've done very successfully for the last 15 years or so. We're now operating in a global environment where every other nation is trying to do the same thing at the same time, so that the competitive tension has become one where international, both investors and construction firms, and every stage of the supply chain is saying to itself, are we going to make this investment in the UK? And if we do, what are the barriers to getting that investment deployed? Or are we going to do it somewhere else in the world, which are also trying to do the same thing, where they may have very different barriers? They may be much easier. So in countries which have got plentiful land supply, introducing solar farms or pylons across unoccupied land is a lot easier than it is trying to do it in one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. So we have to try to change the mechanisms here if we're going to begin to achieve this. And that's what some of the measures to introduced, you touched on community acceptability. Yeah. That's absolutely critical. That's one of the things we're addressing in our report.
Okay, that's really interesting. We'll come on a bit more to the community acceptability point. But these are all matters that are very much on your desk, I imagine, Mark, day in, day out. I thought I would ask you, I mentioned it earlier, about speaking of the pace of change that we need to see, about consenting decisions. We have had just today from the Secretary of State a decision to delay by 1 month a decision on consenting for a major solar farm in Lincolnshire called Mallard Pass. I hear from people in the sector that there's concerns that, given the current state of politics around solar farms and around particularly the debate that exists around food security and solar farms, that actually we're not going to see any of those big consenting decisions for nationally significant infrastructure projects when it refers to solar being greenlit before the election. I mean, what's your reaction to the Secretary of State's decision today?
Well, it's the DCO process is long, arduous, very expensive. The region of £10 million we'll spend on the Botley West DCO, including large deposits to National Grid to secure the connection. We've got upwards of 60 experts working on it, planners, designers, biodiversity designers, and not to mention our team in Berlin. So it's a high risk in that money, if you don't get consent, is simply gone and you move on. But the attraction of the DCO, of the Planning Act 2008 and the DCO process is it gives some certainty. Mm-hmm. So you do everything you're supposed to do. You do your 2 consultations, you do your peer, you do your environmental statement, you go through an arduous examination, public examination, and then you get a decision. Now, Sunnica went through that. They're going to be a year after.
This is another solar farm.
Sorry, Sunnica is near Newmarket in
it's delayed 4 times?
Yeah, so it's good. If it gets permission at the next one, it'll be a year late.
Right.
So you think about when you make an application, you've got to set out you've got to start about buying the kit. You've got to start, because there's long lead times on transformers and power converter stations. And as Philip correctly pointed out, we're not alone here. The world is electrifying. I spoke to National Grid last week, and they said they're struggling to get their gas-insulated switchgear because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have just bought the lot to electrify the system. So you've got to be aware of what everyone else is doing. So you set out on that journey, and the deal is, at the end of that, the Planning Inspectorate give their decision to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, on the whole, tends to pass that on, or if there's a really good reason, legal reason, turns it down. Now, that hasn't happened in Sunnica. Mallard Pass has been delayed by a
month.
A month. But so was Sunnica first time. Then Sunnica was 35 days. So these are, I guess, political decisions, and they won't be made until the election has happened. But that's
you agree with that proposition that a lot of this, all these big solar projects are probably going to be on hold now until after the election?
Well, in terms of, from the developer's point of view, you carry on. Yeah. So we're carrying on. We'll submit our application.
As far as the Secretary of State.
As far as the Secretary of State, I think the feeling is that there is unpopular, and MPs have expressed a fear. Certainly the MPs we've spoken to in West Oxfordshire, and they have expressed a fear that if they support us, even the Lib Dem candidate for the new seat of Bicester and Woodstock has said he opposes us, even though it's his party's policy, has been for 30 years to build solar farms. So he said, I can't support you because my constituents, potential constituents, don't want it, which I think is wrong.
This contrast between the National Party's position around decarbonisation and the local constituency demand.
And yet, in the recent local elections in West Oxfordshire, in May, beginning of May, the group who opposes Stop Botley West, one of their numbers stood for Blaydon and Woodstock. Blaydon is in the heart of our project and is vehement in its opposition. He stood as a Tory candidate for councillor on opposition to us and lost to Liberal Democrats. So I don't know, maybe it's not so unpopular. Maybe if you take a position and say, because as Philip said, we need to have a plan.
Yeah.
The problem is it's all quite piecemeal, but there is urgency here because stuff needs to be ordered and lead times are long. It's going to take us 2 years to build if we get consent, and we've probably got another 18 months till we get consent if we get it. So these are very long lead times, and you need to shorten them as much as you can.
And whether or not it genuinely is a popular proposition in a constituency to have that solar farm built or not, there certainly does seem to be a perception in the Conservative Party at the moment among many MPs in rural constituencies that big solar farms are going to prove unpopular. And I can't help reading into the Secretary of State's decision today, into the statement that came out yesterday around the debate between food security and solar panels. A bit of a political calculation ahead of an election there. You're standing down at the next election, Philip. Do you feel liberated to sort of speak your mind on this one?
So I'm a farmer.
And you're also a farmer.
But I also have solar panels on my farm sheds. And personally, I've got 1/4 megawatt on my farm, 4 farm sheds altogether. And I think that's the right place to do it. And it makes sense for me because I'm a potato farmer and we have electricity demand for 8 months of the year, and it's coming from the roof. I think the constituency concern that I've had has been for clustering of solar farms. I have a small number of, not large in your terms, but 50-acre to 100-acre farms, which, solar farms, and the people, generally speaking, the immediate neighbours will object to that, but they won't object if it's relatively isolated. The problem you get is if you're hundreds of acres or hectares, or thousands in your case, then you're creating a clustering effect which affects a much larger neighbourhood. From a farming point of view, I think the Secretary of State was quite right to say earlier this week that there is a balance to be struck here between productive agricultural land and using it for energy purposes. So restricting solar farms so that they're not built on grade 1, 2 or 3A land, I think was the right political decision. Now, the industry has said that will restrict the scale of solar farms that can be developed, and that's probably true. But we have to come to a balance amongst the population. How are we going to make this work? And taking high-quality agricultural land out of production at a time when we see what impact climate change is having on global food supply routes. We've just done a report on food security earlier this year. It's a short-sighted answer, in my view, and I think the Secretary of State's made the right one.
Interesting. Turner, hearing this debate and this discussion, I mean, does it give you pause about this is just one of several, but here's an exception to a situation where it's easy to do a big energy project, because there is a political debate to be had there, and there are political interests concerned. Is this the kind of thing that we're just going to see again and again and again on the road to decarbonisation?
I think so. I think absolutely, and I think this is the kind of thing that we're starting to realise now. Setting the ambition and getting people to agree on tackling climate change has been, it's been obviously a challenge, but we've kind of got there now, and people kind of broadly agree that we should deal with this, and that's why we've got all these very ambitious targets. But we haven't done enough to talk about some of the trade-offs, and you do need to talk about these trade-offs, because there are trade-offs, and there are decisions that need to be made. And I think we need to shift the kind of political will away from kind of arguing about the targets to start thinking about some of these trade-offs and actually drive through some of these changes. So an example is planning reform, right? Where that is absolutely essential. And probably as a political leader, as a politician, you're going to have to take a bit of a hit on some of it because you're not going to make everyone happy, but you should do it in the best way that you can. So think about how do you bring communities along? How do you, for instance, create a spatial energy plan that means that people can understand why certain infrastructure is being put in certain places. And again, you can use kind of data and understanding of our land and our landscape to kind of better plan and assess where it's best placed to have these things. But there will always be trade-offs, and there are so many of them that will come in the years to come. It's going to be really challenging.
I'm getting a sort of a vibe of targets. Let's not focus too much on them, but I think if there was a Labour representative on this panel, they'd probably be saying, well, how do you attract that investment? How do you give the certainty to investors? How do you give the certainty that the government is wholeheartedly behind this and will back this effort? Well, you put a big, ambitious target on it. And hey, I've even had conversations with Labour officials who have said, yes, we recognise 2030 is very, very difficult, but aim for the sun, hit the moon kind of approach. I mean, surely the targets are going to be, actually Labour's target is actually going to be quite helpful in that regard. Do you think we will see an acceleration in investment and in pursuit of this goal, thanks to having a more early target, essentially?
So So first of all, that target can be useful if it's, I think the good thing about the 2030 target is that it's basically almost within the next parliament. So if Labour comes into government, they will be really accountable for delivering that.
It's going to be interesting.
So that is obviously a positive thing. I think in terms of the investment, though, I think if you speak to investors, they will say the targets are secondary to actually putting in place the conditions that makes that a kind of viable investment. And I think right now, those conditions are not in place. So I think that just saying, oh yeah, we put in these really ambitious targets and that means that capital will flow into renewables, I think is not.
Do you like what you're hearing from Keir Starmer on that? Because I put that question to him when they had a weird huddle when they announced their 28 billion climb down. They got all the journalists into a room in Westminster, and him and Rachel Reeves just told us all about it. And I asked him about that question, and he said that that's our goal, that to get those conditions in place. It's not about the money necessarily even, it's about the conditions, it's about planning reform.
Yeah.
I've got a question on Slido, which is how quickly do you think, you've written a really sort of comprehensive report on this, if Labour is going to get anywhere near that 2030 clean power target, does this have to be a sort of first 100 days, first 100 minutes of government type thing? And what's the first thing they need to do? Is it planning reform?
Yeah, as planning reform, I think is the absolute first thing. Then you need to look at things like, how Ofgem makes decisions. You need to really get the strategic spatial energy plan through. Mm-hmm. So that all of that is really important.
It's currently in the works with the National Energy System Operator.
It is indeed. So I think that needs to happen really quickly, and the planning reform you introduced needs to be really bold, because frankly, if you look at what's in the pipeline in terms of projects, a lot of it's at a very, very early stage, which means that, and we got 6 years?
Yeah.
That it takes a long time to build this stuff. So the planning reform needs to be incredibly ambitious, and then you need to think about supply chain issues and stuff like that as well, in terms of how you can do that strategic planning to get things done.
Mark, as a developer, what do you want to see in the first 100 days of a Labour government on all of those obstacles?
Well, I suspect, given that any DCO that comes up for consent will have been held, I'd like to see the dam open, so return to previous. Because to be fair to the Secretary of State for ESNZ, there have been consents granted, and actually a few weeks ago there was a wind farm extension was actually turned down by the planning inspector and was approved by. Overturned by Claire Coutinho with some conditions. So I'd like to see the uncertainty, because as Turner mentioned, there's a lot of money involved, and there's other countries involved. If this continues, then there are 33 DCO projects on the PIN's NSIP website at the moment. There's about 15 gigawatts. That's not nearly enough. That's for connection out to about 2032, so that needs to be double. But if there's any kind of continuing delay and extension of DCO times, then people won't want to spend the 10 million on doing the project, on funding the DCO. So, no, you'd like certainty. That's the key thing, and also the national policy statements, the ENs 1 to 5, are really firm, and they're really pro renewables and pro ground mounted solar. So just stick to those. Don't politically interfere.
Can I just come in? I think that's a really important point that you're making, that most of what the Labour Party might be talking about needs to be done is being done. The question is, how quickly can it be done? Mm-hmm. And we just heard, having a target for which everybody in this room, bar 5 people, think is for the birds, doesn't really help bring that about. It's just pure semantics. It's a political gesture. We've got, at the moment, 675 gigawatts in the queue for the grid right now. That is more than double the increase required to be at by 2035. So we've got the projects out there. A lot of the projects are never going to be developed. So I think the Secretary of State was quite right last autumn to say we're going to get to a situation where we use it or lose it, these consents, because otherwise it just clogs up the whole system. So the demand is there. Many of the projects are available to go through the consenting process. It's just the time it takes. We've got to accelerate, as everybody's agreed on the panel, both the planning and the grid connection, and the grid connect, both of which are politically challenging in the local community. So we've got to try and make the community, we can get onto this before we finish, community benefit has to be demonstrable to change attitudes and behaviours. And that's where I think the proposal that's come out from this government to require two types of community benefit. So household bills, if you're immediately affected by a significant piece of infrastructure, will come down for 10 years by £1,000 a year. And then community benefits to the local parish or whatever it happens to be for a pylon in the parish, an underground or overground cabling, is a really good idea. It will start to change the dynamic. It's not all bad news. There is some good news in there. And I think people's behaviour will start to change.
Do you have the perception that these campaigns against pylons in your parish, as it were, are they deeply rooted? I spoke to one MP who said that, MP who'd been around for some time, he said that in all his years he'd never seen his constituents so worked up about something as the East Anglian energy grid. And I was quite astonished to hear that. I mean, is it really that bad? Are people really that concerned? Are your constituents that concerned?
I had it in my constituency when the mid-Wales turbines, onshore turbines, were all needed to get access to the grid coming straight across a beautiful unspoilt valley in my constituency. And people were absolutely furious. We had marches in the streets along the Welsh border. So people do care a lot about this, but I've also seen it in other places where they're a bit more used to it, where they've been less they've accepted in the past. I think East Anglia, the challenge there actually is as much about the number of connection points, leave aside the solar, coming from offshore, and the volume of constituencies that are being affected by these multiple access points, rather than trying to channel them or use an offshore ring main, which was what I think the public would prefer.
Labour seems absolutely determined to really take on that challenge. I mean, Keir Starmer in his conference speech used language like sort of bulldozing through the planning restrictions, which almost seems sort of designed to trigger sort of NIMBY concerns in various green and leafy parts of the country.
Well, very few of them vote Labour. Might have something to do with it.
That might have something to do with it, as much as they're prepared to. Do you see that being the tenor of the next 5 years if Labour do get in? Are we going to see sort of Daily Mail front pages of, Keir Starmer's steel warriors attacking our country?
Well, I hope this doesn't become sort of totally partisan. It shouldn't be a partisan debate. As was said earlier, there is now a political consensus that we are driving to net zero. So this is a consequence of it. We've got to change behaviour, and it's in all political parties' interests, in my view, to try to go with the grain and persuade people that this is a sensible thing to do. And that will require, cash handouts by developers in some areas, and it will require other behavioural nudges. Tony Blair Institute's very good at advising on nudges, and I think it's right. We do actually have to do that, and it shouldn't become partisan. Of course, when you get down to the local pressure on the councillors who are making the local planning decisions, then it tends to, the incumbent of whatever party tends to come under a lot of pressure to object.
I do think if you scratch the surface of a lot of these NIMBY campaigns, and I live in East Anglia, and you do see the, green is not green if it's a pylon tearing through my countryside. I do wonder, I mean, surely the person who's put that sign up is also a pretty strong advocate of net zero 2050. Do we need more, do we need a vast public information campaign from the government to say, like, this is why you're seeing all this building work going on. This is the industrial revolution that you talked about. I mean, Mark, I think you're interested in the idea of a public information campaign, and Tuna, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, what would, loathe to ask you just because you're from the Tony Blair Institute, what Tony Blair would do, but what would a sort of master of public, public opinion do to kind of bring the country round on this? Mark first.
Well, yeah, I've done 20 public events in the last 18 months, for our public consultations, and the overriding feeling I got from people, and most of the conversations were very, very sensible, that people just wanted to know, was the lack of understanding of why this was happening. Mm-hmm. And there was a genuine belief that our solar farm, for example, was simply a speculative money-making venture, and that actually it wasn't needed. And if it was needed, couldn't it be in Scotland? So there was, and a lot of, or East Anglia actually was a popular candidate.
Somewhere with lower house prices.
Well, I said, fine, we have lower rent prices, because renting land in Oxfordshire is mighty expensive. But I think the point was that a lot of the conversations began with the words, I have an electric car. I mean, it's part of the problem. But you need to explain to people what is happening. I mean, the UK has never really had an energy policy. And we've tended to back the wrong fuel. Oil in the 70s, then the dash for gas. It's not been a great track record. And what we seem to be doing here is we're going for renewables. We're not going to build any, or we're not going to build enough. But we've passed the Climate Change Act and we've closed all our coal-fired power stations. Or Ratcliffe's got a few more months to go. So we're actually going to run out of generation. So we've got to do something, and we need to explain that to people. One person in the Bladen event said to me, "Oh, we have all those nukes." I said, "We're closing them." And she had absolutely no idea. There is no, why would there be? Your electricity appears, it's fine. But I think, yes, public education or explanation of the strategy, why it's happening. I mean, Philip mentioned that, the opposition to pylons in the 50s when the high voltage grid was built. There was huge resistance to all these in the countryside. People lying down in the road. When Didcot, the only other generation in Oxfordshire, the gas-fired power station, or coal originally, was built, they lay down in the road to stop the lorries getting through to build it. And yet, when it closed, there was a campaign to keep the cooling towers. So, you need to explain to people why it's happening. What you can't do is just appear in their village hall and say, this is for your own good. It's going to happen, so you might as well go along with it. You've got to explain.
What do you think, Tuna? Do you think Labour could do with toning down the sort of the bulldozing language, or is that the kind of attitude that we need?
I mean, we definitely need a lot more infrastructure, and it's going to have to be in place where people don't want it. And I think one of the key things that needs to happen is better decision-making in government that is transparent and understandable for people. Because I think at the moment, one of the problems is that people don't understand why. So I think, take the kind of East Anglia example. I think there's a lot to talk about an offshore grid. That becomes the big thing. And it's because there's a lack of understanding there's been a lack of kind of transparency around how some of these decisions have been made. And I think having that transparency, having that kind of plan so that people understand why this has happened, I think is really important. And then I think secondly on consumer benefits, I think you need to do a bit of both, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to have some sort of consumer benefits for people, because the truth is we talk a lot about the kind of lower bills type of argument, but that comes after, right? So people won't get lower bills until quite a few more years because of the kind of investments that we're making now. But I think it's really important then that those consumer benefits are quite community benefits are quite standardized in a way. So it doesn't become like a whole big discussion then about what community benefits am I going to get, and National Grid gets stuck in like discussions with every single local community on the way when they're trying to build this grid infrastructure. So I think we need to be a bit smarter about how we do some of these things.
Yeah. Just on community benefits, I mean, there are now very tangible benefits to individuals. The 160,000 people, households that have installed solar panels on their roofs in the last year are very good advocates for what that means to their bills, because they can see it. They've got a smart meter. They know exactly what they were paying prior to getting the solar, and if they've got battery as well, they were getting a bigger benefit. I have a passive house development in my constituency where the heating cost, it's not quite the same directly as solar, but the heating cost has gone down by 90% for the people the tenants living in these social homes. And that means they're paying, ahead of the energy spike, they were paying £10 a month instead of £100 a month. I mean, this is very tangible, and they will be very good advocates, those who've got solar. We're going to have a more distributed generating system, so it's not all going to be point to point by these enormous from one power station to where it's consumed. So I think there's an advocacy army of early adopters amongst individuals as well as businesses out there, and they need to be motivated to tell their story.
Tony, you wanted to comment?
No, I was just going to say, I think this is a really important point. There's often a lot of talk about kind of government having big kind of consumer awareness campaigns or whatever, but that's not usually what's most impactful, right? Who you listen to most is like your neighbor or your friend or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, like we need to find a way to kind of create this kind of positive demand-led transition where people want solar panels, heat pumps, passive house standards on their homes, etc., and tell their neighbor and their friend. And that's really, I think, the more impactful way that you create this change, rather than the government telling you that you need to do this.
But can you generate that with a bit of government money into your
so
pocket?
we took VAT
Yes.
off solar panels and now coming off batteries. That's 20% cheaper suddenly overnight.
If you could all do one thing, if you were an incoming Prime Minister after the election, be it a Conservative one or a Labour one, if you could do one thing to really kickstart this industrial revolution as it's been described towards decarbonisation, be it 2030, 2035 or later if we fail, what would it be? Starting with you Mark. And don't just say, get Botley West built.
No, I'm not going to say shorten DCOs, but maybe, I mean, ZARs are very popular, but somebody needs to absolutely oversee the plan. So get the plan. For example, very quickly, there's a 2,500 house development on the edge of our solar farm, brand new by Grosvenor Estate, not a single solar panel on the roof because as the planning inspector said, kicked out the requirement because you don't have to do that. So that kind of join it all up, have a strategy and have someone overseeing it to deliver it.
Philip?
I'd create a cabinet subcommittee whose job was to develop a plan across government.
Doesn't exist. It staggers me that doesn't exist already.
There are, but they have lots of other responsibilities. I would say, just as we did it ahead, in order to come up with the nationally determined contribution of 68% for the COP26, the Prime Minister of the day created a cabinet subcommittee. It was all government departments had to feed into it, and they had a single objective. What is the number that we've got to come to as a nation? And it took them about a year, and they came up with it. It can be done, and that's what decarbonisation of the economy requires.
Tuna?
Planning reform firstly, and then secondly, I think, you need to restructure Whitehall and how the government works. And I think you need to centralise much more in kind of number 10, take leadership, and then you need to set up the business department for delivery.
And the noises that you're hearing from Keir Starmer, from Ed Miliband about their ambitions, should they get into government, do you feel like they're getting that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it sounds like they are. I mean, the kind of 2030 mission is clearly really important to them, and they're putting together plans for how to do that.
Okay. Any insight you can give to those plans that you're picking up at the Tony Blair Institute?
No comment.
Will we still have a DESNOS, or will it be called something else?
I don't know. You're going to have to ask the Labour Party.
Try and get a Labour Party spokesman to turn up, that would be a good start.
Yes, it would be. Well, I think we are coming close to the end of our time, so I think it leaves me only to say a big thank you to our panel for a stimulating discussion. I think I'm probably a bit gloomier about our ability to hit these targets than I was when we set out, but I think we can all agree it's going to be an interesting few years because Labour have put it so central in their political offer. They've said we're going to do 2030, we're going to get there, and by 2029, the next election, should they win this one, people are going to be able to judge them on whether they get there or not. So it's going to be an interesting few years. So thank you for your insights, your expertise. Thanks so much for coming. Cheers. Now, I think we are now heading for a networking break, which I believe takes place in here for the people in the room. The next session starts at 3:45, or perhaps a little bit. 3:45 still, we're still on time. That's not bad going. 3:45, that's going to tackle contracts of difference and the UK's green innovation competitiveness, moderated by my colleague Abby Wallace. Thank you so much for coming and enjoy the refreshments. Cheers.
That's why we need to encourage businesses to invest in capital so that we're more automated. That's why in the budget we introduced full expensing, which makes it very competitive to invest in capital in the UK.
It tells you that the 2030 phase-out date saves billions of pounds across our economy. Today's measure isn't cost-reducing, it is cost-raising.
What is your response to that? That yes, we want to keep people safe, but we also need to protect people's privacy online.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the grid panel and were able to grab a quick coffee and a chat in the break. For those of you I haven't had a chance to say hi to yet, my name's Abby Wallace. I write Politico's Morning Energy and Climate UK newsletter, alongside Charlie, who you heard from this morning, and Nick, who you'll hear from a little bit later on today. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about the government's Contracts for Difference scheme, obviously a key plank in the government strategy to hit net zero and drive green investment into the country, but one which is undoubtedly now facing some tricky global challenges and price pressures that we will no doubt come on to speak to. Before I introduce our great panel, just a brief reminder that if you do hear anything interesting, which I'm sure you will, because we have some excellent speakers, to talk about us on X or the social media platform of your choice. Our hashtag is Politico Energy Climate UK. Please also make sure to use our hashtag if you wish to join the discussion on Slido, so I can pick up questions on the iPad. And don't forget to mention your name and your organisation, if you choose to do so. Now to introduce our great panel, I'm delighted to be joined by Jess Ralston, Head of Energy at Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and Adam Berman, Deputy Policy Director at Energy UK, who stepped in on short notice, so we appreciate it. And Amanda Soloway, who's Minister for Skills and Affordability at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, should be joining us down the line. I'm not sure if you can hear me okay, Minister?
I can indeed, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Well, you're all extremely welcome. I have to say, usually I'm on this side of the room, scribbling ferociously in my notebook and texting my editor, Russ, so it's a real treat to be joining you. Thank you very much for your time. I've heard that the best panels are when moderators actually don't say that much, so I'm hoping to kind of sit back and enjoy the chat, and perhaps we can have a lively discussion. But just to get straight into it, Jess, I'm wondering if we could start with you. Before we consider whether this CFD scheme is actually delivering what it needs to deliver and some of the challenges, I'm curious to know, when you speak to people in your sector, perhaps even from other countries, is the CFD upheld as an example of a real success story for the UK? And has that in any way changed since it was first introduced?
Yeah, I think it is seen as a success story internationally as well as domestically. I think that when you think about how far the CFD's come, when it was brought in, it was all about climate change and first getting that renewable industry off the ground in the UK. And now we're at a point where the costs of things like offshore wind, solar have fallen massively, and that is through the CFD scheme. And also, it's evolved a little bit now to instead of being purely a climate change thing, it's actually about energy security, it's actually about price stabilisation in the energy market, which, let's face it, over the past 2.5-ish years has seen real volatility. And the CFD scheme has worked to keep the electricity price actually increasing less than the gas price. So there has been real benefits of the CFD scheme, particularly over the last couple of years. But I think internationally we've seen other countries look to it as an example of what they want to do with their renewable schemes. And it was all about reducing those costs and getting the supply chain up and running, and I think it's done that. So I think it is a success story.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked about how important it is in providing that price certainty point, but crucially, shall we address the auction round 5 shaped elephant in the room? Like, AR5 didn't deliver what it needed to deliver in terms of offshore wind. We know that they had been warning that those prices weren't set accordingly. Is this a reflection of changing economic realities, or do you think the CFD is just not working as effectively as it should be? Adam, you might want to pick that one up.
So look, I think the AR5 problem and the kind of AR4 problem as well, I hope that we can take as a kind of limited issue that has been solved now and we can move on. That was about a fundamental problem in the methodology within the department, looking at essentially the costs of projects, and so we did have international increases in supply chain, in kind of core component costs for various reasons. Russia-Ukraine conflict, clearly one of them. Other reasons include the massive increase in demand for kind of key components of wind and solar, grid, etc., which has pushed up prices slowly but surely. I hope that we can leave AR5 in the past as an example of what happens when industry and government are not listening to one another in perhaps the most productive way. I think kind of looking forward, the challenge with the CFD is that it really solves yesterday's problem. And yesterday's problem is bringing down prices. And that's fantastic. You know, the huge decline in prices of renewables is in significant part due to the CFD. That's wonderful, except that's no longer today's problem. There's been a recent increase in prices due to supply chain constraints. I have, you know, fairly high degree of confidence that that will come down again. Today's problem is building as many renewables as we can, as fast as we can. That is the only way of getting anywhere close to either the 2035 government target or the 2030 opposition target. And at the moment, we're dealing in a world in which we look at this, you know, we look at CFDs and we look at wind and solar in a way in which we don't look at any other major infrastructure project. For no other major infrastructure project would you say, well, if it's just slightly more expensive, then I'm just going to can the whole thing. Because actually, we're just coming out of an energy crisis where we've spent, about £50 billion supporting energy consumers because of an addiction to reliance on an expensive and volatile international commodity. The best thing to do now is ensure that we can fix in lower prices and price stability for longer. But at the moment, there's quite a narrow view of what that consumer benefit looks like within the CFD programme. And we need to understand that procuring a lot more capacity at, say, £65 per megawatt hour is considerably better in the longer term than procuring a lot less capacity at notionally better consumer value at, say, £63 per megawatt hour. And often we are just talking about that very, very limited range. So I think there does need to be a bit of a rebalancing there and recognising the problems of the future rather than the problems of the past.
Sure. Minister, I want to bring you in at this point, because obviously we've just heard from an expert that perhaps the CFD is a little bit narrow, that it is no longer answering today's problems. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I mean, what I'm hearing, and certainly from a global point of view, is that we do have it. It's an incredibly helpful mechanism to really ensure that we are world leading. And as you say, that there are lots of challenges, undeniably, we know that. And actually, when we talk about AR5, we know that was disappointing, but clearly there are lessons that we learned from that. But I think just coming into the round, as you will know, within my portfolio, you know, I have affordability, which means I have to ensure that we're looking after the customers, but also there's innovation, and also I have the skills part as well, and when you think about the fact that we now have a department which is for energy security and net zero, I think that demonstrates how clearly the government is taking this. But look, I mean, there are some things, absolute commitment to making sure that we are delivering on those renewables, really, really important. And I couldn't agree more with the other panelists around this, the competitive process, you know, allowing to make sure that we really do deploy those renewables whilst keeping the cost down for consumers. And there are loads of things that we have to do. I'm sure we'll be coming onto those. But I think on the whole, you know, we're doing the right thing. The budget, as you will know, for this was £1 billion. There was 800 million for offshore wind alone. So lots and lots of really good things happening.
I mean, leaving AR5 in the past, moving on to talk about AR6. Minister, you've mentioned there is a bigger budget, there are new price parameters. Jess, our industry getting enough?
Well, I think with the £1 billion being a record amount, it's an interesting concept, this £1 billion budget, because in reality it's probably never going to be spent. And that's because the gas price in future is predicted to be similar to the prices that will be secured under CFD. So it's not like we're ever going to be paying £1 billion for these technologies. It's just not going to happen. And I think that at the moment, the Treasury's the Treasury and DESNZ's reference prices don't accurately reflect what the actual industry think will happen with prices, and therefore it's being artificially constrained. And ultimately, what that means is we're going to get less renewables, going to get less offshore wind, and that, at the end of the day, means more gas imports. And if our aim here is energy security, then surely we should be doing as much as we can to lower down those gas imports, and that means upping the budget and making sure that we get the full pipeline of renewables.
Yeah, Minister, I want to come back to you on that point then. Obviously, Jess saying that the budget is actually never going to be used up, that it's perhaps not going to deliver the renewables that we need. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It is. We clearly have
a. You might be on mute, Minister.
I am. I'm not on mute.
Perhaps I'll move on to another question. We'll come back to the Minister perhaps when...
Oh, can you hear me? I'm not on mute.
When the mic comes back. But I want to move on briefly to talk about targets. What are your guys' thoughts on if, and this is a big if, the next round doesn't deliver what is needed? What does that do for the UK's, for example, offshore wind target, other interim targets, wider net zero target? And as a consequence of that, what does that mean for the UK economy if the UK misses out this time around?
Do you want me to come in on this one?
Yeah, and then I'll go.
So on targets, it's really tricky because you need a balance between something that's deliverable on one hand, and on the other hand, something that essentially pushes both industry and government's backs up against the wall and says from the position of politicians, we expect a lot from you and we expect you to deliver more than you thought you could and faster than you thought you could. So I think having targets in and of themselves is a positive thing. Clearly, the government's own ambition for offshore wind, 50 gigawatts by 2030, and I think the Labour Party targets 55 gigawatts by 2030, they are substantial. And before AR6, certainly what we were telling government publicly was there's about 20 gigawatts, give or take, that need to be procured in the next 2 auction rounds because of the lead times of offshore wind projects. They can't just magic them up overnight just because in 2029 you offer a really, really generous auction. It's going to take a few years to turn these projects around. So about 20 gigawatts for these 2 rounds, which means about 10 gigawatts for AR6, about 10 gigawatts for AR7. That's just for offshore wind. I think our current estimate is probably that we're going to see between 3 and 5 gigawatts procured through AR6. That being said, the Minister and our colleagues have that incredibly powerful tool at their disposal, which is increasing the budget, which is if they've had more bids into the auction, then essentially there is capacity available within the auction, they can actually increase the overall budget. So that would be a really, really positive next step. But beyond that, I think the key message has to be here, the point of false economy, which is we need to get to a point in which we are procuring enough that we don't immediately forget the lessons of the energy crisis, that we don't immediately forget that energy security and climate change and addressing climate change is going to be the key way fundamentally of bringing down energy bills. And so I really do hope that governments of any stripe look at the CFD and see it as a mechanism that really can work very well, but even just within the mechanism as itself, we've heard about the reference prices, you've got load factors. There are essentially all these key bits of the methodology which just aren't quite consistent with the market reality at the moment. Through AR4, we kind of suffered a little bit from the consequences of that. AR5 was a really big problem because of that. AR6, it feels like we still have a bit of this problem tumbling on. So I think, there is a real challenge there, and I think it's primarily a challenge for officials to try and really grip this one. And I hope that increasing the budget for AR6 could be a really positive next step in trying to recognise that and address the problem.
Okay, perhaps we should come back to the Minister. I'm hoping your mic is perhaps back. My question to you was on the budget, sort of 2 experts here saying that perhaps that should actually be increased.
So can you hear me? Because I didn't touch anything. Oh no.
We can't seem to hear you, Minister. Okay, we'll move on in the time being, but we will come back if we can get the mic.
Just chip in on that last
absolutely.
As well. I think when you look at what's happened over the energy crisis, we've already spent over 100 billion on wholesale gas over the last 2.5 years. And literally we can't afford to do that again. So if you want to get that energy independence, you want to get that energy security, so that the next time there is an oil and gas crisis, which there inevitably will be, we're actually more prepared and have more, we're less vulnerable, more shielded from that. And that will come from British energy, which will be from offshore wind and things like that. But yeah, we literally can't afford not to do this anymore. It's no longer a case of it's nice to have. It is really a must, because we can't afford to be in that situation again. And at the end of the day, people need to be able to afford their bills, and that will come also from increasing renewables. Sure.
But perhaps we can move on to talk about some of the consequences of under-delivery. Besides, missing that target, we are in a different climate to the one in which CFDs was first introduced. There are only so many vessels and turbines and solar panels being made. The EU is bidding for these. President Biden has some attractive things on offer for technologies like offshore wind. What is the real risk that developers actually look there and think that that's a better offer? We prefer to go there.
It is a real challenge. I mean, there'll be plenty of people around this room that recognise what has happened over the last couple of years, which is essentially that the UK was at the forefront of attracting investment. And it's not that we've dropped to the bottom of the league table, but we've probably dropped between 5 to 10 places on the most investable jurisdictions for clean energy infrastructure. And the reason is that we've stood still. We've continued to administer the same great programs like the CFD, been a real success, But other countries have started to move faster and they've started to catch up. And you see that through the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, you see that through the Net Zero Industry Act, etc. in the EU. And you see that as a result of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, a lot of particularly Western countries are turning around saying, all right, energy security means renewables for the most part. And that means supply chains become really, really constrained very quickly. So I think there is a real risk here. And I think the challenge in the short term is that if we back off, if we don't procure enough in the next couple of years, fine, there's questions of targets. But there's question for me primarily about supply chain, which is we've had a really, really successful, particularly offshore wind rollout. We've benefited through lower energy bills. We haven't benefited so much in terms of jobs, skills, supply chain, domestic manufacturing. There's a real area there that we could foster in the UK that we haven't done particularly well on. And I think if we can keep the supply chain high, we can keep the pipeline of projects really, really pushing through very fast, and at the same time thinking with that industrial strategy lens, how can we actually incentivize some more of this domestic manufacturing, more of the domestic supply chain, as wind, not just conventional wind, onshore, offshore, but now floating offshore as well, is going to be a huge technology of the future, already is in lots of different countries. There's a huge competitive bid that we can take, and you need only look at IPPR's report from yesterday at Industrial Strategy, where they actually looked at wind as the single most important area for industrial strategy for any government thinking about what can match both our kind of skills and our research credentials in the UK to get the right jobs, to get the right industry. So I think creating that pipeline and really, really committing to that long-term pipeline is the key. But in order to do that, we need long-term visibility as industry. So really simple things like, if you are a developer who wants to put in a bid for a CFD, it's a really big process, there's loads of admin, it's very time-consuming and it's expensive. Now that's fine, but what you want attached to that is a sense that you have long-term visibility over your project, so you can give your investors confidence, you can go and speak to your investment board if you're a major industrial. What tends to happen now is that the government offers 1 month before the auction itself all the details of the auction, the parameters of the auction, the budget of the auction. That's just not, that is not a long-term solution. And so I hope now that the government has done the really positive thing of moving to annual auctions, that we can also bring in a longer-term approach to actually how we envisage procurement and actually lay out a pathway for several years, whether it's 2035 or 2030 or whichever government is in, saying if we want to reach this goal, year by year, this is how much we have to procure. And I think that's what's missing at the moment.
And Jess, sorry, I was going to come to you.
That sort of stability is very important, but also policy stability more broadly and the messaging that comes from government. I think it's fair to say that lately there's been a bit of a confused approach to messaging on net zero from the current government. And that's not helpful for investors because they're not just considering the UK, they're thinking about other markets, other countries. And it's very important to have that clear signalling in the long term, as Adam says, in order for them to be able to plan and make those investments. So yeah, I would say that policy stability is very important, but also so is the messaging, the rhetoric coming from the people who at the end of the day are the ones making the decisions.
Do you think in this case, is the contracts for difference scheme currently competitive enough? You've talked about having that long-term visibility, and is there a specific way that you think it could perhaps be tweaked to get that long-term visibility?
Well, competition is an interesting question because, so is it competitive enough in terms of the prices that it offers? Yes, the government's put forward very competitive prices for this round, and I think all credit to ministers for recognising what happened in AR5 and putting forward much better, what are called administrative strike prices, essentially the price ceiling for the projects. But competition is an interesting one. I come from the industry side, so I should be here advocating for competition, and competition is really important, and competition has got us to where we are today. But there's a real question as to whether competition should be the primary approach now if we need to reach these very, very stark targets in short order. And I think my sense is there needs to be a bit of a rebalancing. Obviously, there needs to be a degree of competition. Obviously, we need to ensure that there's good value for consumers. But we also need to recognise that let's put it this way, if this government is going to reach the 2030 offshore wind target, there cannot be a single bid in the CFD programme which is refused. That is just the simple reality. Anyone can tell you that. There aren't that many offshore wind projects. I can count them on 3 hands, the ones that might actually enter into the current round. It doesn't take much more to count the next ones. There aren't that many projects out there. The moment you set up a hyper-competitive framework, which is designed, it's literally designed to say no to some projects, I think is at the point you have to ask yourself whether we've got that balance right.
Sure. Minister, I'm hoping we'll be able to hear you now. Just to come back on a few points there. The first one being that perhaps the budget for the next round actually needs to be increased even more, and that perhaps the scheme itself needs to be tweaked to allow more projects to benefit from it. Do you have thoughts on those 2 points?
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No! Oh, you can? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear
Okay, lovely. Okay, that's the way. I promise you it wasn't me. It was somebody must have muted me. They knew I wanted to get in, but thank you. No. Look, I think as you rightly say, you know, there's always a question, isn't there, around budget, and people will always say, wherever you talk or whoever you talk to, can we have more money, or how do we use the budget, etc. I mean, the actual fact is that this £1 billion investment is a massive sum of money. But there's a couple of other things I just wanted to come back on, if I may, just for fear of losing my microphone. I mean, the whole premise of the energy security net zero is to deliver on energy security net zero. And when say in terms of I'm just thinking about the messaging, I think the government have been really clear about all the things that we've been doing. And we've been doing all those things around the affordability, absolutely essential that we did that. And now we're really making sure we had that energy security. And it is, of course, about offshore wind. It's about solar. It's about all of those great renewables that we have. But there is also an opportunity with innovation as well. And we are world leading in so many things. And one of the things I actively seek to do is get out to visit as many places as possible in order to ensure that we're really encouraging all of that innovation to take place. And so we are world leading. In terms of, say, the money, we know there's been a massive investment. And also, of course, the thing to bear in mind, just my final points, I rattled through these, is that, of course, Secretary of State can increase the budget as well if necessary. So there are measures in there to safeguard, but also I do believe that we are really pushing forward and ensuring that we are right out there, really making sure we're world leading in so much of this.
So just on that point about the Secretary of State can increase the budget if necessary, are you saying that that's perhaps still on the table, or is that completely off the table?
It's within the realms that the Secretary of State can do, but I don't at the moment. I mean, the reality is we've got this £1 billion that we have already, and of course we have for offshore wind. We've got the £800 million as well. So, what I can't do is I can't talk about live auction. Obviously, that wouldn't. Nor would you expect me to do that. So, but that is within the Secretary of State's gift.
Okay. Just because we were talking about sort of competition in supply chains, I wondered if we could move on to talk about how the UK is heavily dependent on China for things like solar. That makes a lot of Tory MPs pretty squeamish. Keir Starmer has also talked about this idea of weaning off China. Obviously, I imagine that's easier said than done. Is there a way that perhaps the UK can do that? And does that in any way lie in the CFD? Jess, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to China, China have had a very clear industrial strategy for decades, if not longer. And the UK hasn't been in that position. So we're now in a position where we're worried about China and how much reliance we have on them, but we haven't done the prior investment into those industries. So we're catching up on ourselves, basically. So I think that when it comes to things like solar, we had companies like Oxford Solar, who actually upped and left the UK to go to the US because of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a number of other examples around clean technology where, again, we've been slow to introduce measures to keep them here, and so they've just gone and left and gone to the US. So I think the Inflation Reduction Act is a really interesting package, and I think it's going to make quite a lot of difference to supply chains in America and possibly beyond as well, because that's another partner that obviously the UK is very close with already. We've got the EU also making massive investments into this sort of technology because, again, they're worried about China. So other countries, I think it's fair to say, seem to be doing more. Yes, we're very worried about it and we're talking about it a lot, but we're not actually doing very much about it, whereas other countries are. And I think we're perhaps needing to catch up on ourselves and get on same table with the US and with the EU.
Just on that point, in the meantime, are there other places that the UK could look? I remember we did a piece on solar not so long ago, and one MP that I'd spoken to, it suggested that the Inflation Reduction Act is a good thing, that if there is a big solar market in the US, perhaps the UK could look there. They called it like friend-shoring.
Yeah, exactly. That's the sort of thing that could happen. We don't know what's going to happen completely yet, but it could happen. Likewise with the EU, they're obviously a trading partner that we do trade with a lot, and there's things like that. I think as well when it comes to EVs, there's a lot happening in Europe with electric vehicles, and the US introducing tariffs, I think, early this week on EVs because of China. So there's a lot of interesting things happening, and it's just going to be a case of waiting to see what the UK does and how it gets itself inserted into those conversations. Because at the moment, I don't feel there's a clear industrial strategy or plan for getting these industries, up and running.
Minister, do you think that is an option for government, perhaps relying more on countries like the US and the EU?
Well, I think there's certain challenges here, and one of the things I would argue is that we've already made a massive investment, and we have made lots of investments in lots of different ways. And I think one of the challenges is and I find it quite fascinating actually that in this country one of the things that we tend to do is we build up businesses, but we don't always stay here. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do. And certainly I've been getting out and about and talking to lots of new innovators and making sure that we are a great place to actually be to stay and be invested in. And we know, for example, like I think I was saying, we've got this £100 million for floating offshore. So there are lots of investments that we are making and lots of opportunities. But what we really need to do is move forward and be world leading. That is the whole purpose of making sure that we have this energy security, so that we're not reliant on other countries. So we're not reliant on other technologies, and we are world leading. And there are so many examples. I don't want to go down a list of investments that we are making, but we have made so many investments, and I have the greatest of privileges of going out and about and seeing where these investments are made and seeing the innovation that comes out of that. And I would say, it's very easy to say we need more of this, we need more of this. I would like to celebrate the great things that we are doing, and I just think it's really important that we do remember the really great things that we are doing.
Just because you brought up floating offshore wind there, I wanted to go back to the panel here on stage. The government wants to secure 5 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2030. As far as I'm aware, only one floating offshore wind project has ever secured a contract under CFD. How is the government going to secure floating offshore wind when I imagine supply chains there are even tighter than, for want of a better word, regular offshore wind?
Yeah, I can start off on floating offshore, but maybe just a final comment on the trade one with China. Look, we're not going to be able to domesticate every part of every single supply chain, nor should we seek to. We're not the US. We don't have those fiscal resources, not least because the Inflation Reduction Act is in UK terms a really poor piece of industrial strategy, which is that we have to choose favourites. We can't choose everything. And there's a lot of really bad projects that are being procured through the Inflation Reduction Act as well for technologies that probably aren't the future. So I think the fundamental question should be for us, should we look at something like solar manufacturing, which China has dominated the global market? It is astonishing the way in which they've done it, but have also brought down prices to a ridiculous level. Is that the key area where the UK suddenly wants to, think up a manufacturing renaissance, or should we accept that there are some countries in which they can do things cheaper and actually look to other strategic areas? Clearly, there's a geopolitical angle to that, and I'll let foreign policy experts come in on the trade-off there, but I think that's difficult. Look, on offshore wind, on floating offshore, it's in the CFD programme. That's really positive. It's exactly where it should be to try and bring down the costs over time. Clearly, supply chain is going to be a challenge. I think the concern with floating offshore is that, there are some projects in the pipeline, but if we want the UK to be a real hub for floating offshore wind, there probably does have to be a bit of renewed attention on it. And for me, the hub is less the actual putting the pylon in the sea on the floating platform. I mean, yes, that's important, but I think floating offshore could be an area where there really is an industrial strategy play, where we can think about how to secure some of those supply chains in the future, and that requires a very joined up strategy across government, looking at everything from manufacturing through to skills. And I think that, that is the thing where we see lots of different ad hoc investments into things. We see £500 million here for an EV factory or a gigafactory. These are all positive things. I have no problem with those investments, but a more coherent approach to why that money is going there and why it's not going to other places, that we may also have a strategic play, I think is the real question for any government thinking about these technologies.
Okay, I want to briefly mention Labour, because obviously we don't have a Labour representative on the panel, but their clean power target is more ambitious than the government's. Obviously, you will all have heard that this morning. Obviously, there's a bigger story here about what's done with gas, but in terms of sort of the renewables piece, is there a world where the parameters of the contracts for different scheme would have to be more ambitious, and actually the offer would have to be much greater again under a potential Labour government if they're to hit that target? Jess, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to different targets, I mean, when you look at the actual difference between the two, they're not that dissimilar. So the Labour target is 100% clean energy by 2030, and Conservative is 95% clean energy by 2030. So no matter what your target is, you've got to invest very quickly and a lot into these industries if you want to reach them. So I think that whatever the next government looks like is going to have to be a priority to get renewables up and running and getting them built and getting them producing power so that we can have energy security, so we can have lower bills. And specifically, I'm struggling to remember the question specifically, but I think it was around...
About whether an offer would have to be greater, yeah.
Yeah, I think with the CFDs, I mean, yeah, if you've got a more ambitious target, then you probably need to look at your parameters and be a bit more ambitious with them. Things like the budget, if you want to deliver that, then make the budget bigger or get rid of the budget and just have loads of offshore wind, get the whole pipeline built. And Adam may have thoughts on this as well, but when it comes to the difference between the two parties, there's not that much difference, and whatever you do, you've got to be really ambitious.
Okay, and obviously contracts for difference is only one part of the puzzle. You know, we need a lot of enabling infrastructure, we need grid connections, we've already talked about sort of supply chain. It feels like we're no longer in a world where, you know, we can uphold CFD as this sort of linchpin of the government's energy strategy. It feels like it has to be one of many linchpins, I guess. What are the other key barriers that you guys think immediately need to be tackled to sit alongside the CFD?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard some of them already today, so apologies if I sound like a broken record. But look, I think planning is going to be key. Planning underpins both the rollout of the renewable infrastructure itself and grid. It's the single biggest blocker to the rollout of grid. And if there is a government that really, really wants to push forward on planning, they're going to have to be quite aware of some of the political trade-offs, and particularly what it means for some local communities. You know, we've already spoken to some degree about things like community benefits. You know, I get a little bit frustrated with this conversation, because it feels like where we've ended up as a community in the energy and kind of climate sector is, oh, well, we'll just pay off people for putting something in their backyard. And you know, you go back to the 1950s where we kind of built out the high voltage transmission infrastructure. There was a huge campaign, and it really appealed to people's sense of nationhood. It appeals to people's sense of creating a better life for them and their family and their friends and family around the country. There would be lower bills for everyone. There would be more energy security for everyone. And so I think when we're looking at things like planning, getting community benefits right is going to be really, really crucial. But at the end of the day, we do need to get things built. And so, you know, when we're talking about should there be some bill reduction for a house a few miles away from a pylon, I think if you go and visit, you know, let's say National Grid that's building out transmission infrastructure in East Anglia, what they'll tell you is the people who are most opposed to that project would never take money because they see it as bribery. So you've got to be really, really careful about how you have that trade-off. But at the end of the day, we have to build that infrastructure because we've just paid the price of not building it over the last 2 or 3 years. So planning is going to be really key, grid's going to be really key, and I think there are a lot of Westminster and Whitehall processes which could really, really be sharpened to deliver on the kind of a much more rapid decarbonisation of the power sector.
Jess, do you have things that would be top of your list besides planning, grid? I know they're big ones.
Yeah, planning is a massive one. I think as well, reducing our demand in the first place. So things like insulation. Whenever you speak to people, they're all in favour of insulation, and the current schemes aren't delivering at the pace that they aim to be delivering at. So I think there's a real piece there around reducing demand for energy in the first place. Because as Brits, I think as well, people hate waste. And they hate to think that the money that they're spending on their gas bill, which at the moment is very expensive, is simply being leaked out of the house and going elsewhere. So I think insulation is a massive one. I think as well, talking about household technologies which can help to manage the grid. So it links a little bit to planning, but things like electric vehicles, heat pumps, that can all help to manage the grid. But it is all about making sure that we have those installed in people's homes, and also that people know how to use them. But when you think about the energy system of the future, there's a lot of things that will change for people, and making sure that people are aware of what's going to happen, I think, is massively important. But I think planning is a big one in reducing demand. Yeah.
Okay, I want to take a few questions from the audience and the iPad. Minister, I believe this might be one for you. AR5 was a success for tidal stream. For AR6, the government reduced its ring fence to 10 million. Would the minister consider increasing this to 30 million?
Well, I think that would be more a question actually for the minister who has that within their portfolio. So I can take that back and ask them.
Okay, all right. Well, perhaps we could look forward to hearing an answer on that one. Just some final thoughts from you guys. The title of this panel is obviously called Contracts for Difference, Go Big or Go Home. If you guys were in charge of the CFD scheme, if you held the policy strings in 55 Whitehall, what would it look like? What changes would be made? I know we've already discussed this a little bit, but...
Well, look, the CFD fundamentally works. It has been really successful. We've had a rocky couple of years, but it's still, the fundamentals of it are great. We just need to make sure that we're adjusting the methodology so that we can deliver as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Clearly, the scheme shouldn't be designed so that it's, you know, offering money to projects that can never get built or that aren't far enough in their kind of DCO process. But we need to be sure that as far as possible, every single, you know, industrial scale renewable project that is priced, you know, within pretty wide parameters is given the green light. Because without that, we're not getting anywhere close to any target on any side of the aisle in Westminster. So for me, it's just about maximising it, getting the most out of it. And one of the things I would say as a way to do that is not to be distracted by other things that I think have sometimes been thrown into the CFD. So, you know, for example, there are some, you know, obligations for companies if you get a CFD, but the government is now thinking of offering a bit of like a top-up payment for companies that have, you know, higher local content obligations, things like that. It's a nice idea in principle, but I'd love an actual industrial strategy rather than an industrial strategy crowbarred into a mechanism that's working really well. So for me, that's how the CFD should work. But the final thing I'd say is there's a left-hand, right-hand problem. We're here talking, and you know, I think the minister's comments are spot on about the success of the CFD. But we just had a ministerial statement yesterday from the Secretary of State talking about solar on industrial on land in the UK, and particularly it's going to affect industrial-scale solar arrays. So we have a problem here. You can't be ambitious in one area but not ambitious in the other, because if you don't allow the projects to come forward, there won't be enough pipeline to actually go into the CFD projects at all. So there are a range of things from unblocking the, you know, bizarre planning ban on onshore wind in England through to making it a bit easier for solar. There are lots of things that we can do, but ultimately that left hand and right hand have to be balanced. And I think I've had so many great conversations like this around the CFD. CFD is a great mechanism, but unless it's paired by stability in other areas, from planning through to market arrangements, you're not going to get the investment through in the projects you need.
Jess, do you have thoughts on that one? What would your ideal CFD scheme look like?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Adam said, and I think as well, if the aim here is energy security, energy independence within the next, I don't know, 10 to 20, 30 years, then we're going to need to build renewables as fast as we can and as much as we can, coupled with things like reducing demand and bringing in low carbon heat, all that sort of stuff. But I think with the CFDs, yeah, that they still work and they still deliver. We can be more ambitious on things like the budget and the reference prices and all those things that Adam's been talking about need to be tweaked in order to maximise that pipeline and make sure that we get the most out of what is available. So I think definitely go big, but I also think that there's other things around certainty and policy stability that will be very helpful for the industry, so that they're not considering, oh, well, maybe we'll go to the US, maybe we'll go to the EU instead, and the UK remains that place where they want to invest. And that comes from messaging, that comes from talking about renewables as being the future, not oil and gas, things like that, where at the moment it's a bit confusing. Being completely clear and being completely sure about what it is that we want from our energy system, what we want from our industrial strategy, I think that would be really helpful.
Sure. Just another question here from the audience. Supply chain is essential to deliver grid and generation, and capacity must expand fast. Should we have equal emphasis on attracting the expansion to the UK? I know that maybe ties in with what you were saying, Adam, about sort of incentives to for sort of domestic supply chains in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, my very brief comment on that is, yeah, sure, more supply chain would be great, but I think we kind of hear this request all the time of, let's bring more supply chain to the UK. brilliant. What do you mean? Are you talking about turbines? You're talking about cabling? There's a whole host of different components that go into solar and wind being the kind of established mature renewables. I sort of don't really mind. I just want a decision. And I think a lot of industry is looking around and saying, whatever it is that the government thinks is the big strategic play of the future, this is one of the industries of the future, we're going to really foster this industry, we're going to build a proper, all-encompassing government industrial strategy around this, and we're going to build out the supply chains for this so that we can really make the pipeline of projects much bigger in the country. Whatever it is, in terms of these clean energy technologies, I'll be in favour of it. I just love to see a little bit more clarity on what it is.
Minister, I want to come back to you to give you a chance to respond to those comments that the do you think the CFD is a proper industrial strategy?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Just some closing thoughts from me. One thing we haven't mentioned, and I would have liked to have talked a bit more about skills as well, just to say that we have got a green jobs plan, which we're really helping with those skills. That's really important. But I do think, absolutely right, everything that everybody's been saying around this holistic approach, thinking about this as the way we go forward. And there is a massive, we are thinking about this. We are thinking about those supply chain initiatives as well. We've seen that coming through Giga as an example. We know that there are lots of things to do, but what I would say is we're always welcome to also have views as well. And these guys will know, we're reaching out constantly, having those conversations. And I know we've probably got about 1 second left, but thank you very much. Well, because I think conversations like this need to happen. We do need to be talking. You have my assurance that not only do I talk to other partners across the House as well as other stakeholders, but we're always welcome to thoughts. But I say we are absolutely mindful. It's a holistic approach that we need.
Just one more question for you, Minister, because this is on your brief. Now that we have you, any update on when that skills workforce plan is going to come out?
Well, we're so we've got the green jobs plan delivery group that we're working with, and we've also got the plan that's coming out. I am absolutely determined that we get this absolutely fit for purpose. I anticipate it's going to be out in the next, hopefully 4 to 6 weeks, but I would rather have a plan that really does what it says on the tin, is really fit for purpose, we can put into action and does make a difference, rather than say to you, we're ready in 2 weeks and not quite there.
Okay, well, I think that perhaps brings us to time. Thank you all very much for your time. Thank you, Minister, for joining us online. Thank you both for joining me here. The next panel will follow straight away. My great colleague Nick will be chairing a panel on CCS, so please do stick around. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and I hope to see a lot of you at the happy hour later.
Uh, 10 seconds. Hello, welcome everyone. Moving on. Hello. That's not working. Wait, I'm not sure my mic's working. Hello, is it working? I'll push and wait until that's, yeah. How about now? Hello? Hello, welcome to... Okay, cool, okay. Cool, just go. Cool. Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to settle down? Cool. This is the final session of the day, so congrats for making it this far. It's not too far away from drinks, so I appreciate you all coming and hearing this rather, I think, excellent conversation we have about carbon capture and storage, and the wonderful joy that neither the government nor Labour will be here, so you'll be here to have some meaty policy discussions and no various half-truths or obfuscations, one hopes. And, you know, as we understand, carbon capture is a significant part of our energy agenda. We're looking at a 20 to 30 million tonnes per year saving potentially in carbon emissions by 2030, and on an annual basis at 50 million tonnes by 2035, which makes it a very appealing prospect. And as we've seen, there's a £20 billion spending commitment from the government on carbon capture. So I'm here to talk about this potential opportunity with my colleagues here, with Ros Bullied from Green Alliance and David Cairns from Equinor. I think the best place to start actually probably is with the money, in fact, with the £20 billion commitment that's been made. One of the few things the government actually hasn't rode back on in the last few months when it comes to green energy agenda. Do you think this is the best allocation of resources, David? And do you feel as though this will be enough to tempt the industry into doing major projects?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks very much to Politico for letting us be partners with this event. It's been a really fascinating afternoon. So, I mean, Equinor's role in carbon capture storage, just to share it, is so we do carbon capture storage in Norway and have done since 1996. Also in Norway, we're developing the first cross-border storage of carbon capture called Northern Lights. That's taking CO2 from elsewhere in Europe and storing it in Norway. And then thirdly, we are investing in the UK to do carbon capture and storage in the UK. So we believe it's part of the solution. If you look at the sort of headlines for our Northern Lights project, it's an industrial solution to an industrial problem, and we agree with that. And then to your question on the money, so £20 billion for the UK to invest in this is a lot of money. And we know just how hard the DESNEs and the Treasury teams are working on this. They've done really, really fantastic work. And it sounds a lot. So I think the question then, when we see Treasury, they say it all the time, what is the best place to spend each pound? And I think where the UK is on this is on the early stages. So the government is saying, we're going to invest in this now, but we expect it as quickly as possible to become commercial and to wash its own face. That's what's happened essentially on offshore wind, and that's what they hope to happen on this. And we're part of that.
Are there any hurdles between yourselves committing to carbon capture projects and for the whole construction development period between you and the government? Is there any policy changes you think need to be addressed or made, or are you pretty happy with where things are?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the challenges for the government, it is creating a new industry in the UK, and that's not easy. And the UK has tried this more than once. For those who've been involved for a long time, an earlier project was closed in 2014, 2015 by the government because of cash. And this year is crucial. So this September, essentially, that the government and the companies such as us and BP and others who are involved in it will take our decisions to invest or not. And so I think everyone is hoping to get these first projects away, because that then starts it. It gives confidence to the industry that it'll carry on. If we collectively fail, that is going to be difficult for the UK for the next few years.
What were Equinor's full-year profits last year?
Equinor's full-year, internationally, were large. I don't have the number to my head, but just to say on profits. So we are a large company involved in oil and gas, and we make profits on that. We make profits on our renewable industries. We're also the second largest tax-paying company in the world. Yeah, so we pay our dues into society as well.
Sure, I mean, you do make a lot of money too. That's why you pay a lot of taxes, to be fair.
Yeah, it's true, and that's, you know, it's I tried to say that, but Norway has had a tax regime of 78% on oil and gas since the 1970s. It also has a regime that encourages investment in it since the 1970s, and the product of that and saving that money is a sovereign wealth fund worth $1.4 trillion.
When we talk about vast sums of money, do you think there might be better uses for the £20 billion when it comes to carbon capture? And do you think perhaps that we should be selective about what processes we use for carbon capture or not?
Yes, I mean, it's really great to see 20 billion being committed for something that is to be welcomed. 20 billion put towards energy efficiency in homes, or something, some of those other hard to solve issues would be equally welcome. And I would also say that if the industry thinks, the oil and gas industry thinks that CCS is the solution, could it have started a bit sooner itself and using its own money? Very, very keen to see the government move to that kind of point of a market-based approach. And ideally, that would be a polluter pays principle as well from our point of view. I mean, something like the carbon take-back obligations that have been raised where there would be an expectation the industry invests in return for as a proportion of its activity. Seems to us very appealing, because I think there is a question as to why this is the particular sector that has been targeted for support. I also think actually that the longer we wait for that investment, and it's government and industry, but the longer we wait, the more actually alternative solutions are being found. So we don't have any coal-fired power plants anymore to fit CCS2, which was the original intention with these CCS. We also don't have any fertilizer industry, which was another sector that we were going to apply CCS to. And the steel plants, where CCS was seen as really a viable solution a few years ago, and now looking at recycling with electric arc furnaces and potentially using green hydrogen to make green iron, maybe not in the UK so much, but globally. So I think there is a question about the uses, as you were saying, Nick, that they're shrinking over time, and actually that's really important. I think there are some uses that we do think there are viable reasons in certain sectors for CCS, but we would be concerned about a really blanket approach. And I think if there is going to be a lot of public money going to the sector, we need to be really careful about where that is being applied and from which uses.
Sure, I understand the point around sort of being fiscally prudent. I guess one question around CCS though is that it would be seen as a way of being able to continue and ensure employment across the North Sea oil and gas sector, which is also a hugely important industry in the UK, and the risks that deindustrialisation faces. We've seen Keir Starmer talk about this. We've seen under pressure from the unions about this, for example. Is there a risk that think tanks aren't sensitive enough to the realities of the employment of the North Sea oil and gas sector and the need for sort of ensuring a plan out of industrialisation? And can carbon capture and storage perhaps be part of that?
The oil and gas sector has the levers, it certainly has the skills and expertise, but I think it should be applying those itself to addressing the problem. I don't think it necessarily needs the government's support in order to do that. And we absolutely need a plan to transition out of fossil fuels. I'm very sympathetic to the need to find alternative jobs for workers. I think what I'm concerned about is that we keep linking carbon capture and storage and continued oil and gas extraction. We heard Rishi Sunak do that last summer really clearly. Very happy to see CCS and definitely think there are valid sectors in which should be used, but at the same time, we're really clear that fossil fuel extraction has to be phased out.
Just coming on the role it plays. So I think one of the good approaches the UK has taken on this is to focus CCUS on these big industrial clusters. So the Humber, Teesside and Liverpool, where you've got a whole range of really highly emitting companies needing a solution for those emissions. And Roz is quite right. Over time, there are different solutions for different companies. So sometimes that can mean closing, which is not good locally. Sometimes they're going to be moving your operations elsewhere. Sometimes there might be new technologies that means it's not necessary. But if I take, for example, a Dutch company called Yara, who is our first customer for the Northern Lights, they'll be sending 800,000 tons of CO2 a year to Norway to allow their ammonia production facility in the Netherlands to carry on and be zero emissions. That's a good bit of industry that the Dutch want to keep going.
Absolutely, but I think of the clusters and the projects going ahead, there's actually only one cement plant that I understand it, of the projects going forwards in the clusters. There's quite a few people looking to do blue hydrogen, which I don't think is the kind of, should be a long-term solution. And there's also things like sustainable aviation fuels, which we know are not the best approach in the long term. tackling aviation. So when it's on things like cement plants, yeah, or when it's used for direct air capture, absolutely, really see the potential benefits short-term and long-term, but I think some of those other uses we'd be a little bit more worried about.
So we've had there's a bit of disagreement here about whether the track 1 and track 2 selections were the right ones.
Well, I mean, in the track 1, we put forward a lot of different projects. So in the Humber Saltend cluster, we've got the whole of the Saltend facility, which has got chemicals, ammonia, et cetera, and they haven't been chosen so far. We hope they will be in due course, but that the government has chosen which projects to proceed with at this stage, and so we respect that.
One key area for this, I guess, is also the sense of continuity, because obviously we have an election probably coming this year, and although it's a shame that Labour weren't here for this panel, I was wondering if you were looking for any sort of certainty around Labour's approach to CCS, because obviously if the polls are accurate, we could have a different regime and different party in charge of the Westminster. I didn't call Ed Miliband the regime leader, sorry. Yeah, so is there any need for certainty around Labour's approach to CCS? Because we haven't really heard much from them about, well, basically any energy policy for about 2 years now. But on the issue of CCS, what's your thoughts on that, Roz?
I mean, I guess I would be a little torn here because I've just said that there's better uses of spending 20 billion, but I'm very much committed to the long-term policy certainty. So I think what I would want to see is them also rapidly moving towards that kind of market-based solution in which the costs don't fall on the taxpayers for support. I would agree that we don't know very much about Labour's policy in areas like this. I imagine they'd be looking for consistency as well, but I don't know.
I mean, I think what I've heard them say is actually pretty supportive of the industry. We know they want to develop the cluster in Scotland, in Acorn, for example. I think should they come into power, they will have the same question you posed at the beginning, which is what is the best way to spend each pound to try and get the energy transition as fast as possible?
Sure, and from your conversations, what do you think Labour's answer is to that question? David?
So we had the discussion earlier on about the 2030 target and so on. All of these targets are huge, and none of them are likely to be met as put. But actually, what they are doing, as other panels have said, is it's driving things faster than would otherwise have happened, and that's great.
Sure. So when it comes to the projects that you're looking at, for example, the one in track 2 and Teesside that you're part of, you don't see any friction if, for example, Labour were to take power in the next sort of 6 to 8 months. That wouldn't have any sort of continuity problems for you in processing your CCS projects.
I don't think so. So, for example, earlier this spring, that the government announced that the UK would need new gas plants as a sort of temporary supply, and Labour didn't argue with that at the time. I think everyone's, the last 25 years, roughly, the UK has been pretty consistent in its energy transition policies to be ambitious on it and to move as fast as it can. So, future gas is going to be only if it's abated through CCS and nothing else.
Sure. When it comes to CCS, although it's like an established technology, it's still a fairly nascent industry in terms of like where it is right now relative to the scale you're trying to build it to. So I guess the question is, for example, it's been 32 years since we actually built a reservoir in this country, 29 since nuclear, about 9 since any meaningful onshore wind developments. What makes you confident that you can basically build up an industry from, well, not scratch, but from a very low base in time to meet an agenda over the next decade? I'll go with David first.
Okay. So just some of the numbers and the scales. So from our storage that we do in Norway, each well that you drill allows you to store about 1.5 million tons of CO2 a year. So to meet that 2030 target you mentioned earlier, that means that the industry will have had to drilled between 10 and 20 wells by 2030. Is that likely? Probably not, but will there be some? Yes, I'm certain they can. And then back to the earlier point of discussion, which is the UK is trying to create this industry. So what the UK has is this fantastic bequest of the North Sea. If you're living in Germany, which is Europe's largest industrial country, you don't have a place to store your CO2. But actually, the North Sea can be part of that solution to that problem, which is why you see discussions between Norway and Germany, between the UK and elsewhere, as for a future that actually, essentially, UK and Norway together can help solve that problem.
There are significant differences in UK and Norway. For example, you mentioned a sovereign wealth fund, but there's also the reality the UK has an aging, kind of creaking basin now that's going to be declining significantly. Norway is a bit earlier on in its journey towards maturing, I'd say. Do you see that as being an issue, having some sort of UK-Norway combined policy, being a Norwegian energy giant?
No, because I think what we have is same geology. So those oil and gas basins, which are coming to the end of their life, provide the geology for us to store CO2. So if over time there is an effective, efficient, economic way to make this part of Europe's energy transition, then that's great, surely.
What are your thoughts on this, Lots?
Yes, there have definitely been challenges in quite a few of the CCS projects around the world. The ones in Norway are success stories, relatively speaking, but there have definitely been projects that haven't gone so well. So I think one thing is really important is just to get on and test whether it works in the UK context, actually. I think if it doesn't, and given how much CCS is in the UK's plans as well, then we really need to find some alternative solutions. So actually I'm very supportive of us getting on and doing it as quickly as we can to see if it's a viable solution. If it's not, then we need to really seriously think about diet change and not flying and some of these things that are just politically quite challenging. So yeah, I think it's important to find out whether that works. I also think potentially there's some risks around suggesting it will always work. I'm slightly worried that the kind of expectations, if we get one or more projects not working, how that conversation is going to go as well. So I think there's a kind of question around the comms. But yeah, certainly I think it's good to be aware of the fact that this hasn't always been a straightforward technology and capture rates can't always be as high as hoped.
Yeah, do you think there's any risk of that at all, of the projects actually that, like for someone in the track 1 process, only on track 2, but in track 1, if projects don't actually have the potential that you think they have, Equinor will have to pivot, right?
Yeah, I think the reality of any project is, as Ross said, we want to get on and see if it works. We think it will. We think we've done our due diligence to make it work, but you don't know until you start. So we will. And that's why the government has, it hasn't approved all the projects thus far. It's given a lot of money, but it's only given money for a certain amount to see if it works, see if it's affordable, and see if it can be replicated.
Yeah. If you were Preston, would you rather £20 billion to spend on CCS or energy efficiency?
It's definitely better to reduce energy use at source, so I would go for the energy efficiency. Ideally, we'd have larger budgets generally and not have to pick and choose between our various children. But I think it's critical that we actually, and CCS should be a last resort really. We need to make sure that we're reducing energy at source. We need to make sure that we're consuming less and doing everything we can, that we shouldn't be kind of resorting to these end-of-pipe solutions.
Yeah, the reason I touch on this is you've kind of prompted it, which is there a risk that CCS actually takes us away from the real question, which actually is about how much we have to reduce our energy usage in order to actually meet net zero, and the behavioural changes maybe that might be politically inconvenient to talk about actually being more important than continuing oil and gas production or CCS as a mitigation measure? What do you think on that, David?
So I think the idea that energy usage is going to decline is unrealistic at a global level, because energy usage at a global level is going to increase. As countries like India get richer, they want to have the same standard of life as everybody in this room, and so at a global level it's going up. The issue is about how to make sure that without those high standards of life, it's not polluting the planet as much as we are today. So it's about new technologies providing that great prosperity, but also at less carbon footprint.
Does Equinor have a pathway for reducing oil and gas usage generally alongside its CCS aspirations?
Yeah, so basically we see ourselves as an energy company. 20 years ago we just did oil and we just did gas. Today we do oil and gas and solar and wind and floating wind and batteries. And in 20 years' time, we'll do more different stuff as well. And I think what our position, and this includes investing in the UK, is for long as you need oil and gas in the system, we think we can produce that in as a sort of environmentally best way you possibly can, at the same time growing as fast as you can your renewables.
Sure, and on that fast-growing renewables, what's the current breakup of fossil fuels and renewables at Equinor in terms of spending and profit?
It's by far oil and gas,
yeah.
But if I look at the UK context, our investment in the UK is for every pound roughly we invest in oil and gas, we're doing about 2 in the others.
Sure, do you have any set specific targets on on phasing out the oil and gas itself over
No,
decades?
we don't have a target to phase it out.
Okay.
Because as I say, I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the big panic was, are the lights going to go off? Not so much in the UK, because UK's security is okay, but if you were in Germany, where all of your gas came from Russia, they were really worried, and actually they turned to Norway to help them out. We as an energy transition group here, if in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, suddenly the lights are going out in the UK because we've made a mistake, our population will absolutely crucify for this, and they'll be right to do so.
Sure. Sorry.
I mean, but if you look at something like Rosebank, it is the majority of it is oil, and it's going to be exported, though.
Yeah, it is, and it's going to be exported to Europe. So, we produce a lot in Norway, and all of our gas and all of our oil today goes to Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think often people criticize saying, well, it's not about UK security. I think that downplays the UK's role in Europe's energy security. So if our investment in Rosebank can help Germany keep its lights on, that's a good thing.
When it comes to the question of Rosebank itself, though, I mean, they talk about the very low emission levels for it, but if you actually involve the refining process after extraction, the numbers are much more tight than compared to, well, when it comes to gas, it's actually much of a muchness. So.
Yeah, I don't think that's quite right. So, obviously the biggest emissions from oil and gas is when you burn it to use it. But the energy you use to produce it is significant. So if I take an example from Norway, we have a field called Johan Sverdrup. It's an oil field, and it produces 700,000 barrels every day, which is it's huge. It's powered by hydropower from shore. So most oil and gas takes about 20 kilograms of CO2 per barrel to get out of the ground. Johan Sverdrup takes 1 kilogram of CO2. So in 700,000 barrels a day, 19 kilograms per barrel less of CO2, that's quite a lot of CO2 saved. It doesn't, of course, deal with the burning it at the end, but all of our industries are trying to reduce the emissions in all of our processes.
Sure.
And so that also goes for Rosebank. So our ambition for Rosebank will be to electrify it if we possibly can, and that will bring that emissions from about 13 kilograms per barrel to about 3 if we get there.
Sure. I mean, would you be prepared to commit to the electrification of the platform rigs at Equinor? I mean, for the Rosebank project?
So we've said that's our plan. So we are investing today. So the production ship, which is being fitted out in Dubai, we're spending about $150 million so that it's electrification ready from day one.
Yeah, because I guess when it comes to CCS, there's a real sort of emphasis and need for sort of trust to basically, do you take people sincerely when they talk about mitigating their carbon use, carbon emissions rather, and I guess that there'd be quite a big signifier when it comes to CCS, whether it's sincere, if we see with Rosebank actually that there is reneging on, for example, the electrification of platform rigs, which I know at the time the NSTA wrote letters to all the providers, producers, wanting to insist that actually does happen. And obviously they have their own North Sea targets as well. So would you accept that's quite a big bellwether for whether we should actually trust Equinor with net zero, how much it actually commits to what it says it's going to do with Rosebank?
Yeah, so I think if you look at what we've done in Norway, we can, we're a company that's quite proud of our record. Do we have more to do? Of course we do. Do we need to accelerate transition? Yes, of course we do. So, but our investments in the UK are in good faith, following that Norwegian model. And we're not just doing oil and gas. We're with SSE building Dogger Bank, world's biggest wind farm in the UK. That's a $10 billion investment.
Sure. Do you have any thoughts on further thoughts on Rosebank? Do you want to outline?
I suppose that one of the things from my point of view as well is that the government's subsidies and through tax breaks for fossil fuel projects, which just seems, again, it's another question if it's that way you want to spend the money. And particularly in the case of Equinor, where, essentially that goes to Norway's sovereign wealth fund, or a share of it potentially goes to Norway's sovereign wealth fund. So I would, there's the bigger moral question. Someone needs to stop producing oil and gas somewhere, and maybe the UK and Norway would be the sort of countries that are able to make those decisions. But I think also, at the very least, we should be careful about where we spend subsidies.
Sure. When it comes to Equinor and their renewable projects, as well as CCS, that's part of the whole mitigation we're talking about. You obviously have offshore wind and talk about Dogger Bank, but when we spoke with offshore wind for Equinor, they raised concerns that the pot wasn't big enough for the allocation rounds. Is there a case that companies are being a bit greedy to be demanding a bigger pot for renewables and then also a big pot for CCS? You know, if you look at the CapEx, I mean, I kind of made this point earlier at the beginning, but just sort of to reiterate it, if you look at the CapEx and you look at the profits that Equinor has made over the last 2 to 3 years, like, surely if there was a business case for these things, you would have pushed them already.
Yeah, so I mean, you had a discussion before about offshore wind. So the UK, as we discussed, has a really good track record on developing offshore wind. The last auction round that got no bidders, I mean, the UK government could have taken a position which was, unless it's cheaper than last time, we're not doing anything at all. Because there is a sort of assumption around the industry that it's always going to be cheaper. But the lesson of the past couple of years is, inflation does have an impact. So I think the government has done a brave thing, which is say, okay, for next round, it will be more expensive electricity, but it allows the projects to go ahead. Now, is the industry making lots of profits? I think that's debatable. If you look at the losses in the supply chain, it's been some really, really tough years. And if you look at the margins and the share prices of some of the developers who are just doing renewables, they've also had tough years. So I think to describe it as, it's easy business, which is easy to make money, is really misplaced.
Mm-hmm. There's also a fact, obviously, that in the US, we saw offshore wind, there's been challenges, and also carbon capture elsewhere. There's not Norway, there's been challenges getting off the ground. Are you optimistic, Roz, that we'll actually be seeing these burgeoning carbon capture and storage projects in line with the government's estimates? Or, much like many energy projects the government commits to, the dates can be quite flexible when it comes to actually when they're visible to us all?
Yeah, I am not a specialist on CCS engineering, but I share your concern that most large projects in the UK do seem to take longer than expected. So I hope that, as I say, I really hope that doesn't happen, because I think we need to know if this works, and if not, find some other things to do instead. Yeah, well, sure. I think that's...
One more thing on the CCS before I get to the questions is, are you surprised at the lack of sort of government announcements in recent months since the Track 1 and Track 2 shortlistings? And is that any sort of concern for you, again, on the process of delay, on being slow, and the fact there's an election coming up, which gives a wonderful excuse to push things back? Is that any sort of issue for you in terms of making decisions, Equinor?
So I think the reason it's been quiet is since the Track 1 announcements and the budget announcement back in the spring, those companies involved with the first track projects are essentially negotiating with the government to get to a final investment decision on both sides. So that it's bound to be quiet now. This autumn, this September, is absolutely crucial. So do those projects get going or not? We'll know yes or no.
Sure. Radio silence concern for you, Roz, or not so much?
No, I mean, I still think it's good that we actually move forwards with something when we've said we're going to do it. I think I do have a bit of a concern about the subsidy models, these so-called business models, which sounds much nicer than subsidy. There's kind of a proliferation of them now across various different bits, and it's very hard, actually, for anyone else to scrutinise them. Very hard to know what's going on, whether they're good value for money. And I think this is another reason I'm really keen to move to kind of market-based approaches. What I'm concerned about is they might end up skewing the choices that sectors use. So, for instance, industrial electrification could be a really good opportunity for more sectors, actually. We're seeing industrial heat pumps become viable solutions and kind of able to provide greater heat and things like the chemical sector. But there's no kind of subsidy, and the electricity prices are relatively high for industry in this country compared with other countries. Meanwhile, we've kind of got a CCS business model that offers a short-term capex loan as well as kind of long-term revenue certainty. And we've got similar with hydrogen. There's a kind of green and blue hydrogen equivalence, really. And I think that there's a real danger that we end up kind of encouraging people to go down the route that isn't the right route. I mean, we've got this far, so I guess hard to do a complete about turn, but I think what we would want to be looking at is kind of getting more things in the ETS, thinking about carbon contracts for difference more generally, some other kind of models that don't risk that kind of distortion.
Yeah. Sure. And if you go back to the early days of offshore wind, I think there was the same debate definitely with Treasury. Is it worth what was at the time very expensive prices to get the projects going? And it almost didn't get going, but it did. And we look back now and thinking it was good to have that government subsidy support to start with, kick it off, and then eventually it works and is much more commercial.
Sure. On to questions with the iPad with Slido, and the most popular one of the day is on the question of lobbying. And the question is, I'll start with Roz, is how do you view the lobbying efforts by the fossil fuel industry, such as their push projects like Rosebank, to delaying progress towards these, I'm guessing, net zero targets?
again, it's quite hard to judge because we're not in the rooms. Certainly as a kind of think tank and NGO, the government listens to us, but we don't get that kind of access that oil and gas companies get. And there are groups that, you know, in the past there's been hydrogen kind of councils and things, which there's no NGO or civil society representatives on. And I think that's really problematic. So I definitely would like to see kind of full transparency about the conversations. I think that really is important. And the kind of, the imbalance, there is an imbalance of power in some of these conversations, and that I think there needs to be ways to bring in kind of more voices and make sure that the directions we're heading down and the use of public money is kind of the right approach.
On this question of lobbying, what are your thoughts on this? Because obviously people point to lobbying as a sort of like potentially like nefarious activity, but do you see like lobbying as dialogue between your companies and government? Do you think lobbying is a harm to net zero? I mean, Equinor are in principle in favour of net zero. Do you find that your lobbying efforts are undermining your own target?
So firstly, I would don't undersell what your organisation manages to do, because you have fantastic access and influence with politicians. And secondly, Equinor is a state-owned Norwegian company. You know, so we are owned by the Norwegian people. And the energy industry is one of those industries which is very, very highly regulated, so such as telecoms or defence or what have you. And in all of those industries, neither government nor business can do it by themselves. So you have to have a dialogue between the two to make sure that you can work together to achieve your joint goals. And I don't think that's lobbying. I think you see both the Labour Party and the government here in the UK saying they want to work in partnership with business to get stuff done. In CCUS, the government wants to invest its money so that industry invests its money to create an industry of the future. That's what conversations are about, nothing more.
Sure. You'd push back on the idea that, say, Equinor had like unhealthy access or too much access to government for a democratic process to work around things like net zero?
I don't think we do have unhealthy access. I think we have, we're the largest supplier of energy to the UK. We supply a third of the gas. Of course, we should have access with them. The most phone calls that I would get from the government are if they hear that there is a fire in a refinery in Norway, because it suddenly, is there an impact on UK supply of energy? Those are reasonable.
Sure. On this issue of like geographic dependency, I suppose, on Norway, do you think CCS and the North Sea generally, do you think there is a risk of being too dependent on the North Sea for our energy needs and that being continued through CCUS?
We already are very dependent on the whole world, well, a range of countries around the world for our oil and gas. So I don't think North Sea is going to provide our oil and gas, even with the best of intentions. So.
It's quite a fiery Slido with the questions, so I must have to be careful with how I phrase things, while also avoiding getting eggs by any protesters. So another question's come in, which is address the elephant in the fact that Labour didn't come to this panel. Is there any concern that the shift of government could lead to a shift in the agenda? And we sort of touched on it earlier when we talked about whether CCS would have continuity, but is there any concern Equinor has around this potential instability from that change?
So the Labour Party has put out some very ambitious green transition plans, and we think those are great, frankly. We're kind of Norwegian and slightly dull. Sometimes, but what we like as business is you covered this before, is predictability and stability and long term. So the UK, to be its credit, has been great on this for the last 20 odd years with a pretty ambitious net zero leadership. We don't like that being politicised. So seeing that a future government, if Labour are successful, that they want to be ambitious on that, we're all power to their elbow, and we will want to be part of that with them.
Sure. And a question for Ros. Oh, just slid away a second there. When it comes to CCUS, if it's not the solution for many of the things that we talked about earlier, like cement and steel. I only said you were supportive for cement, for example. Do you think there's a risk that maybe you're downplaying the extent at which it could be supportive of various industries, heavy industry, that we're particularly caring about now?
Yeah, well, if it proves the best solution, I think what I'm worried about is that we'll skew the market with business models that kind of provide support in some areas and not in others, and we can't then see what the best solution is. Certainly, if you look at what the CCC was predicting for in its advice to the sixth carbon budget, there's quite a lot of CCS in there to support industry. I suppose my question is actually, at that point, we perhaps didn't know as much about electrification as we do now. So I would feel like electrification would nibble some of those sort of uses, nibble away at some of those uses. But electrification does have some issues too, which need to be solved, for instance, about delays to the grid. So which solutions are the best and most efficient, and what speed can we roll them out? There's quite a lot of kind of calculations that need to be made, and it'll probably be made on a site-by-site basis. I think there is going to be a situation where we're used to kind of one or two solutions per industry, combined heat and power plants in a swathe of industries, for instance, and perhaps we're moving to a situation where, and in domestic heating too, perhaps, where might get sort of a mixture of different types of solution. In domestic heating, you might get kind of low temperature heat networks, etc., and some heat pumps, and we might sort of start to see a diversity in industry as well. So I think it's a kind of interesting but quite exciting kind of question, is actually what is the right solution in each sector.
Sure. Do you expect many sort of Green Alliance esteemed reporting anytime soon? Some further publications, some further things we disseminate to our readers at MECUC, Morning Energy Climate UK, about where to go for CCS and where to go for cement, heavy steel, those sort of things?
Well, yeah, we have several bits of work on steel that we've done already. I can tell you more about those if you're interested. And chemicals, I think the way that the crackers, which is the big, very high temperature heat bit, I think they are looking at CCS, and perhaps in the short term that is the best solution for various technical reasons. But actually there's an awful lot in this chemicals industry of medium and low temperature heat that could be addressed for electrification, and that's part of my concern there. And yeah, we'll keep looking at other sectors. We're gradually working our way down the kind of list based on emissions impact. But Green Alliance puts out lots of reports. This is it's our bread and butter.
And when it comes to the question of looking ahead with CCS, do you anticipate that there be further projects Equinor could announce alongside the ones they've already done? Would you see commitments of further projects in CCS in the UK?
So we have our own targets as a company for CCUS globally.
Yeah.
So we have projects in the UK, we have projects in the US, we have projects in Norway, and we have projects in continental Europe. And to the point about UK's role in this, we think the UK has been ahead in the last few years. It's slipped back in the last couple, but we think if they get stuff away this autumn, it will put them back up towards the top of the pack again. But as Ross said, CCUS is not the only answer for the energy transition, but it has a small niche role to play within it, and we will be part of that in the countries where we're operating, I'm sure.
Sure. Are there any things that you haven't touched on today that you want to get across from Equinor's position in particular? I was thinking about, because I realised that there's a lot of pressure on oil and gas companies, and I think some of it's understandable. And I was wondering if there's any sort of message that you're trying to convey that we can all leave with when we exit this event and go off into the evening.
Yes. So beers are waiting, which is great. So I think as a sort of final point, before doing this job, I was living in Sweden. And the most famous Swede is the activist Greta Thunberg. And she has changed the world and focused on climate change. But she also says, if you can't get to 1.5, get to 1.6. And if you can't get to 1.6, get to 1.7. Every point of a bit helps. And I know you started the session at 2, and it felt slightly despondent about, are we going to make it? Can we make these targets? But actually, the more we can do, the better. Setting out ambitious targets gets you further. And I think companies like mine want to be part of that solution. And we're trying, not denying, as they say.
Sure. And last word to you, was on today's panel. Any further final parting thoughts?
I suppose one thing we haven't really talked about is the public conversation. I mean, CCS doesn't get much mention. Maybe that's fine. Maybe it can quietly happen with engagement in the local communities. But I think there are some important questions here, as we've discussed, about kind of how much we pay and who pays and over what time scale, and kind of which technologies we might want to use more generally. And I think it's a shame that there hasn't been more of an effort to have those conversations at times. And I think to also persuade to kind of get the demand point I mentioned up front as well. on people's agenda more. You know, we have a choice. We could actually use less energy, and then we won't need so much of these kind of technologies. And I think sometimes that politicians are scared of having those conversations, but if we could get to the point that we're talking about these things a bit more, that would be really helpful.
So Equinor quoting Greta Thunberg and you talking about lean to fly less. Nice final messages. Okay, thanks guys. I think that's basically everything from us today and this afternoon. And thank you once again to my two esteemed panelists. I believe there's, I need to introduce Kate Day back to the stage, political deputy editor, and we'll skedaddle.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, and I promise not to keep you from the drinks for very long. I hope lots of you will stick around. We'd love to see you all downstairs and join us for more conversations. What a great session. I feel like we've covered an awful lot of ground. Everybody seems pretty agreed that the big targets are looking tricky, I would say. And even the government minister accepted that even 2035 is probably quite a challenge. So lots for us to think about. We've heard that the government's flagship subsidy scheme could be increased. We've heard a bit from Equinor about what they would make of a prospective Labour government, should there be one. Lots about NIMBY challenges, which I think has come up a lot in our coverage over the last year too. So keen to hear all of your thoughts on all of those, and a big thank you from me. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you so much.